If you've ever studied ancient Egypt in your history class, then you are probably familiar with the way they buried their pharaohs. When a king of Egypt died, their body would be entombed in a huge sarcophagus, usually after being mummified. Mummification was the process that the ancient Egyptians used to preserve their dead, safeguarding a corpse with special chemicals and the application of cloth almost like bandages. This was done to keep cadavers from decaying, usually because of the belief that this would carry over into the afterlife. And it wasn't just the Egyptians that practiced mummification either. Mummies of human beings or animals have been found on almost every continent in the world. Sometimes a body can even be accidentally mummified through exposure to extreme cold, lack of oxygen, or other environmental factors that help keep the deceased preserved. Fun fact, the oldest recorded mummy isn't even one left behind by the ancient Egyptians. It is actually a naturally mummified severed head, estimated to be 6,000 years old. It was unearthed in South America in 1936. Yes, corpse preservation techniques can indeed be strange, but none are stranger than SCP-1176. Also known by the nickname, the Mellified Man. Now, as you may have already pieced together, the Mellified Man is a mummified corpse, but not quite like the ones you would expect to find buried in the pyramids. Estimated by Foundation researchers to have been a man in his mid-30s when he died, SCP-1176 is a corpse that has degraded so much over the centuries that it has made DNA examination impossible. According to some of the SCP Foundation's best minds, SCP-1176 is possibly of Arabian ancestry, and thought to have passed away sometime during either the 10th or the 11th centuries AD. This is certainly not your ordinary mummy, and it definitely isn't like the kind you'd see in a cheesy black and white horror movie or on an old episode of Scooby-Doo. SCP-1176 is absolutely, undoubtedly dead by all clinical definitions. It doesn't show any signs of breathing, and the processes of blood circulation or metabolism have long since stopped. However, despite the decay suffered by the rest of the body, SCP-1176's brain seems to have remained intact for almost 10 whole centuries. Not just intact, but active. The Foundation's researchers have confirmed that the brain has a constant level of electrical activity, consistent with people experiencing Stage 3 non-rapid eye movement sleep, known colloquially as deep sleep. So, a mummy with an active albeit dormant brain. How does an ancient culture manage to achieve preservation like this? Alien technology? Cryogenic sleep chambers? Suspended animation? No, not quite. SCP-1176 exists in its current state in part because the body has been mellified. Now, this was a process a lot like mummification, but instead of wrapping them in cloth, a mellified man, or a human mummy confection, was created by submerging a dead body in honey. According to historical records, elderly men in Arabic countries would sometimes willingly volunteer themselves for this process. Why? Because the goal was to turn their bodies into a healing confection. In other words, an elaborate sweet delicacy created from a preserved corpse. That's right. Ancient cultures had candy made from dead people. All the information the Foundation has gathered about SCP-1176 seems to point to the body being one such mellified man. When extracting the remaining bodily fluids from the corpse, instead of finding blood or other normal substances, Foundation researchers discovered that SCP-1176 was full of a viscous gold-colored liquid that they designated as SCP-1176-1. Further testing of this fluid revealed it to be, you guessed it, honey. Specifically, it was a type known as clover honey, made by a species called the Anatolian honeybee. This stuff was everywhere, filling SCP-1176 entirely. So much so that honey was even coming out of the body's pores. This is due to the nature of the mellification process. Typically, before death, a person who had offered to sacrifice their own body would stop eating any food. Instead, their diet would consist solely of honey and nothing else. They would even bathe in it, submerging their entire body in the substance inside and out until their sweat and even their feces were pure honey. This honey-only diet would eventually kill the donor, and their corpse would be placed in a stone coffin, which was also filled up with even more honey. After approximately 100 years, what would be left was human mummy confection, a honey-based candy of sorts that could be then sold at street markets for a high-value price. Why was it so expensive? Well, not just because it was literally made from a dead person, but also because this confection was believed to possess rare and powerful healing properties. Everything from the common cold to broken bones was said to be cured by it. Despite it leaking out of SCP-1176, the honey doesn't seem to ever run out, even when tested under varying conditions. It seems like the mellified man actively produces more of the sweet golden substance, acting as the source rather than a container with a finite amount. And yes, it is still edible after several centuries. In fact, it contains an abundance of essential vitamins and nutrients. According to the Foundation's testing, the honey produced by SCP-1176 can suppress the feeling of hunger for up to 18 whole hours, and there are no long-term side effects for most that eat it. However, this is not the case for everyone. The Foundation has learned that any person without the blood type AB positive will have a severe allergic reaction should they consume any of SCP-1176-1. The symptoms include acute hemolysis, which means the red blood cells won't break down properly, and renal failure, which is when the kidneys stop functioning. This all results in death for most of the subjects without AB-positive blood who were fed SCP-1176-1. The symptoms for these unlucky people were the same as receiving an incompatible blood type after a transfusion. In 1985, the SCP Foundation launched a raid on a facility in Asmara, Eritrea, which at the time was owned by a group called the Mana Charitable Foundation. Agents had been dispatched to this facility after various rumors and reports that pointed to this location being the source of a strange honey substance. This anomalous liquid was being shipped to a number of areas in Ethiopia that had been stricken with famine. Pretty easy to guess where the Mana Charitable Foundation got all that honey, right? The problem was, because SCP-1176-1 caused adverse effects on people without AB-positive blood, a considerable amount of civilians had died from consuming it. Hence, the SCP Foundation was forced to step in. When SCP-1176 was first uncovered, the body had been stored inside a large stone sarcophagus, as was part of the ancient practice of creating a mellified man. There was also a copper pipe and spigot installed by the Mana Charitable Foundation to extract the honey from within. The lid, sides, and inside of the sarcophagus itself had a number of Egyptian hieroglyphics inscribed within. These were mostly spells and ceremonial texts written as a way to protect the individual that was to become the mellified man. There were also inscriptions written in the dialect that was an early precursor to the Arabic language. However, these sections had been replaced with updated versions in classical Arabic. One of these read, Abdallah ibn Salah ibn Ayyub ibn Nasir, 15th son of the great Sheikh illegible, was put to the fast of honey on the 1st of Rajab in the year of the Hijra 3 illegible, and died on the 15th of Ramadan. The great Imam al-Yusuf has sealed him within the ancient vessel, marked with the signs decreed by the ancients to ferment in honey for 100 years, and bring aid to the people in time of need. Much like a headstone used to mark the grave of someone who has passed, the sarcophagus that SCP-1176 was in featured a passage commemorating a man who gave his life and body to heal others. Sounds nice, right? But there was another inscription written elsewhere on the stone sarcophagus, which translated a dire warning. Beware, Imam, for the mark of Iblis is upon this one. According to the rest of the second inscription, the tomb containing SCP-1176 had been opened before. During a time of great famine, Imam al-Malik had ordered it to be opened so that SCP-1176-1 honey could be used to feed the starving people. Jars upon jars were filled with the anomalous golden liquid and brought to the sheikh, the ruler of the land, as well as sent to the people suffering from the lack of food. However, the very next day a number of these people fell ill, stricken by a terrible fever that ultimately claimed their lives. Only the sheikh, his brothers, and his sons, who had all eaten the honey, survived. Any others who hadn't been killed by the fever accused the sheikh and his family of sorcery, and these surviving subjects attempted to destroy the body that had produced this cursed nectar. But when the sheikh's people found the mellified man, they witnessed in horror as the body stood upright, dancing around as it screamed and taunted the people. Al-Malik declared that the devil himself sent an evil spirit to corrupt SCP-1176. The honey confection was meant to be a means of healing, but it had been corrupted. The sarcophagus was then sealed, and the inscription on it finished with the following caution to any that found it. May God strike down any who would break these seals. Countless centuries later, once the SCP Foundation had recovered SCP-1176 and the sarcophagus containing it, they began testing with the mellified man. Their goal was to determine how much of the SCP-1176-1 honey the ancient corpse could produce, perhaps in the hopes of using this substance as a form of hunger-relieving field ration for their operatives. Removing the body from its sarcophagus, Foundation researchers placed SCP-1176 on a metal grate, designed to drain the honey as it was produced instead of allowing it to build up. Over the course of several hours, more and more honey seemed to be produced, beginning at a rate of almost a liter per hour to almost 56 liters every hour. But then, after 10.5 hours of producing what seemed like an endless flow of honey, something unexpected happened. The deceased body of the mellified man, dead for hundreds if not thousands of years, woke up. Foundation staff detected a spike in brain activity. If you cast your mind back to earlier, you'll remember that SCP-1176's brain had managed to survive and stay intact long after it should have decayed. The mellified man opened his eyes and immediately started to wildly flail around. He made a number of distressed sounds, the long dead body trying to crawl towards the outskirts of the testing chamber. Thanks to so many of its organs and muscles having withered away over the years, SCP-1176 was barely able to see or understand its surroundings. It couldn't speak, not properly anyway, given that its tongue had long since decayed. The Foundation's personnel moved in to try and restrain the ancient and now animated body, hoping to sedate it before SCP-1176 caused any lasting damage to itself. Eventually, staff were able to force SCP-1176 back into its sarcophagus, slamming the stone lid back in place and trapping it within. They could hear the once human creature screeching and vocalizing from inside, bashing against the inside of the stone coffin with its head and limbs. It took 3 whole hours of this for the mellified man to return to its usual state, by which time its ancient bones were fractured beyond repair. SCP-1176 is a sad tale of a man who had willingly given his life to be a source of healing for people in need. He allowed himself to be mellified, turning into a confection that could bring an end to famine. And yet somehow, this was corrupted and turned into something that spread fever and pestilence. For now, the mellified man sleeps, but his brain is still alive inside. While he might be asleep, he may never be able to rest. No matter how different we are from each other, everybody has a shadow. It is a constant companion, always with us no matter where we go. Unless where we go is in a room with all the lights off, of course. As a child, shadows seemed mysterious or even terrifying. But as we get older, we learn that shadows are nothing to be concerned about, just your body blocking light. Of course, at the SCP Foundation, nothing is what it seems, and a shadow is never just a shadow. Near an abandoned Air Force base in Afghanistan, nestled next to a set of human remains, the Foundation discovered an unusual object capable of turning a simple shadow into a prison. SCP-272 is an iron nail, 11.5 centimeters in length, covered in engravings of an unknown origin. The engravings have not yet been identified or traced to a specific civilization, but the research staff assigned to the object have described them as captivating but scary. It was discovered during a sweep pulled out of a rock face by a member of Foundation personnel. At first, he believed it to be an ordinary nail, until he dropped it. Suddenly, for no apparent reason, he was unable to move from the spot. He stood there calling out for help for 20 minutes before another member of personnel picked up the nail and he regained full range of motion. SCP-272, like many other objects in Foundation containment, is almost eerily mundane. Aside from the engravings on its surface, the nail looks like any other nail you might find scattered on the ground. Its true nature only reveals itself if you happen to drop it. Determined to learn more about the nail's properties, limitations, and potential unknown adverse effects, the Foundation conducted a series of experiments. The first experiment was conducted at the discovery site for SCP-272, the rock face in Afghanistan. A D-class, referred to as D-272-01, was handed the nail and instructed to hammer it into his shadow, in the area of his feet. Once the nail was 2/3 into the rock, 01 was no longer able to move. He attempted to run but could not lift his feet. He stood there sweating and immobile until he collapsed from heat stroke. At this point, a researcher intervened and attempted to carry the unconscious man out of the sun. No matter how hard they tried, his body could not be moved until they removed the nail. 01 was taken to a hospital and administered fluids and a medical exam, and testing was suspended for the day. After determining that the nail immobilizes its victims by trapping their shadows and them in place, the research team wanted to test the limitations of this effect. If the nail needs a shadow to work, then what happens when there is no shadow present? A new D-Class 02 was selected and brought into the same discovery site. This time, however, they went after dark at approximately 10 p.m. The nail was dropped at 02's feet and embedded itself in the earth without needing to be hammered. Then 02 was instructed to walk 10 meters away from the nail. He managed this easily with no adverse effects. The experiment was relatively uneventful until 02 attempted to flee the scene and was terminated for his escape attempt. The body was disposed of, and the research team made note of their findings. The nail does not work if the subject is not casting a shadow. So if total darkness kept the nail from working and bright light meant it worked completely, what would happen if the light changed in the middle of the experiment? 2 hours before sunrise, the very same night, another D-Class was brought into the site. The subject, 03, was instructed to walk away from the nail in a straight line until he was told to stop. 2 hours later, when the sun came up, all hell broke loose. 03 was pulled into pieces as his body attempted to make its way back to the direction of the nail by any means necessary. His legs were yanked back towards the nail and were collected several feet from it. His torso, on the other hand, was located 106 meters away from the nail, with signs of road rash and severe trauma. 3 cleanup teams were required to remove all evidence of the carnage. The nail was removed to test facility 25-H, and the team decided to put an end to any further experimentation involving sunrise. Several lighting-based experiments followed the sunrise disaster, all with relatively uneventful findings. The research continued in this way until one member of the research team, Dr. Cho, posited a new question. What happens if the nail is embedded in 2 overlapping shadows? 2 other members of D-Class personnel, 04 and 05, were positioned under stadium lights so that their shadows overlapped. The nail was dropped onto a point where the shadows were on top of each other and promptly embedded itself in the ground. Both subjects were instructed to attempt to move away from the nail. 05 was completely trapped, unable to move her feet or walk away. Meanwhile, 04 was able to move freely with no consequences except for a feeling of a chill. So the nail is only able to hold one person at a time. In an attempt to see if there is a pattern present in terms of which person the nail will hold, if presented with multiple options, a follow-up experiment was conducted with 8 members of D-Class personnel, ranging in age from 18 to 59 years old. All 8 subjects were placed with their shadows overlapping, and the nail was dropped onto the point of overlap. The youngest subject, an 18-year-old boy, was held still by the nail. The other 7 test subjects let out a scream when the nail hit the ground and were reported to shiver throughout the duration of the test. When the 18-year-old was taken out of the study and the experiment was repeated, the second youngest person in the group was held in place. The experiment was repeated 4 more times, removing a subject each time until subject 07 collapsed from hypothermia. The next experiment was conducted outside, in a grassy field near the test site. Subject 05 was placed on the grass and handed a shovel. Once the nail was firmly in the subject's shadow, she was instructed to dig it out of the dirt. 05 began digging and proceeded normally at first. After 90 seconds, however, she fell to the ground screaming in agony. A medic rushed to her side, but by the time he reached her side, she was already dead. An autopsy determined that subject 05 died of a cerebral hemorrhage with no clear physical cause, though it appears that the attempt to remove the nail is what killed her. The research team decided to take a break from human trials and take a closer look at the physical properties of the nail itself. What weaknesses did it have? Could it be destroyed? Subject 09 was given the nail and a collection of tools, then instructed to go to town on the object and attempt to destroy it. 09 placed the nail in a vise and attempted to go at it with an angle grinder. As soon as the grinder touched the nail, 09 fell to the ground, seizing and speaking in tongues, hands pressed to his temples. 30 seconds later, he was dead from the same kind of cerebral hemorrhage that killed subject 05. Examination of the nail revealed a small amount of surface damage, showing that the nail likely can be destroyed, but is somehow able to defend itself against destruction. Regular human trials were resumed the next day, and Subject 10 was brought into the test facility. There, one stadium light was placed on a computer-controlled track, allowing the light to be shifted incrementally from a remote point outside of the room. The light was set up to cast a long shadow, and the nail was dropped into the shadow's head. Immediately, Subject 10 was unable to walk away from the nail, in keeping with the standard effects of SCP-272. Then the light was slowly raised, moving the shadow. The subject was dragged along as the shadow moved, as if yanked by his feet. He stumbled and had to work to regain his balance. Then the light was moved quickly. Again, the subject was dragged along with the motion of the shadow. However, due to the rapid pace of the light's motion, he was unable to keep his balance and fell to the floor, receiving scrapes, bruises, and mild road rash. Finally, in an attempt to see what might happen if the subject was unable to move even against his will, 10 was restrained. His feet were chained to the floor and a chicken wire screen was placed between him and the nail. Then the light was moved again. To the horror of the research team watching, these restraints did nothing to lessen the nail's hold on the subject. He was pulled forward violently, and the chains ripped from the floor and his body slowly forced itself through the chicken wire, landing on the other side in a pile of tiny pieces, like a potato shot through a tennis racket. No matter what is holding them down or what is in their way, a subject cannot escape the pull of their shadow or the prison of the nail. They will be bound to it, even if it kills them. Testing was temporarily suspended while a cleaning crew attended to the room, taking the rest of the day to get the bloodstains out of the concrete. The final experiment on record was conducted the following day. Subject D-272-04 was placed in the center of the room, with one stadium light casting his shadow at a 45-degree angle. The nail was dropped onto 04's shadow and he was held in place. Then the research team simply waited. Food and water was provided every few hours as well as a bucket to use as a bathroom. For the first 2 days, the subject seemed relatively normal, if exhausted and upset. On the third day, he did not respond to food or water when it was offered. After a week had passed, the subject began to speak in rapid manic screams of what was determined to be a dead language. By day 11, the subject was switching back and forth between bursts of intense ranting and a catatonic state. Finally, after 14 days pinned to the spot by the nail, Subject 04 was set free. As soon as the nail was removed, they began speaking English again. They were severely malnourished and visibly traumatized, but immediately began to recover once freed from the nail's hold. Portions of the subject's rants were recorded and translated by Dr. Kimuro, who attempted to interview the subject on the 14th day of the study. At one point, the subject said,
"I cannot sleep. The screams are heard. I am not warm. The shadow steals."
When asked how he was feeling, the subject began to tear at the skin on his arms and shout,
"I am the prisoner of my own foolishness. Let my flesh crumble like the apple whose ashes burn at my tongue!"
Not the most cheerful thing to hear, but not too out of the ordinary for a day's work at the SCP Foundation either. Following this experiment, human experimentation with SCP-272 was suspended until further notice. SCP-272 is kept in a small wooden box, hidden in a vault at Sector 25. Because nothing happens to the object as long as it is left alone, no further containment procedures are considered necessary. When the nails were moved from containment for experimentation, staff have been instructed to take extra care not to drop it. SCP-272 is considered a safe class SCP due to its inability to act on its own. It does not appear to do anything when left alone. However, there is clearly a great deal more to that little nail than meets the eye. Somehow, it is able to wreak psychic havoc on those it traps, and on anyone who might try to harm it. The more we learn about the nature of SCP-272, the more questions crop up. Where did it come from? How does it get inside people's heads? What did Subject 04 mean by the shadow steals? We may never know. But if you find yourself picking up any strange nails one of these days, make sure you don't drop them. The SCP Foundation specializes in tracking anomalous creatures, entities, or objects, and protecting mankind by keeping these anomalies contained. It doesn't happen very often, though, that an SCP surrenders itself to the Foundation, offering to be contained without putting up a fight. You might think that that would be a welcome change for the Foundation's personnel, getting an easy containment like that rather than having to devote valuable time, resources, and even lives to capturing an anomaly. But then you have to ask the obvious and worrying questions. How did this anomaly know where to find the Foundation so that it could turn itself in the first place? Did somebody send it? And if so, why? Well, don't worry. You don't need to try and imagine this scenario. Because an SCP turning itself over to the Foundation under mysterious circumstances has actually already happened. One day, security personnel at an SCP Foundation containment site opened the front door to find an SCP just sitting there on the doorstep. The anomaly was brought in for questioning, and while it was soon designated SCP-032, it has sometimes been known by another name, Brother's Bride. SCP-032 is a person, or rather a replica of a person. Not a living statue that moves whenever you look away or a waxwork that comes to life when the sun goes down. No, this replica is far stranger. SCP-032 resembles a human woman around 30 years of age. Who made her, who she is supposed to resemble, and just where exactly she came from are all still questions the Foundation have been unable to answer. But what the research teams have been able to determine is what she is made from. Brother's Bride consists largely of plastics, at least the external portion of her body. Her skin is made from a combination of 5.5mm thick silicone and other plastic fiber polymers, all colored with a pigment to more closely mimic the shade of Caucasian human skin. SCP-032 has been referred to as a Type F human simulacrum by the Foundation, meaning that she has an imperfect outward resemblance to a human being, and the internal workings of her body are drastically different from an ordinary human's organs or central nervous system. What does SCP-032 have instead? Well, she lacks any skeleton or any of the other internal parts that make up a human body. Instead, her insides are entirely refined liquid oil. However, in spite of having no bones, no organs, and existing as just pure oil filling up a plastic skin, SCP-032 has no problem moving on her own or communicating verbally. When she was first discovered waiting outside the Foundation's Slovakian compound, Brother's Bride claimed that she had come there to be stored. SCP-032 is imperfect in how closely she resembles a human being, and this becomes more apparent the closer one gets to her. At a distance, she can maintain some illusion of appearing to be fully human. However, her appearance becomes less and less convincing as someone approaches. Naturally, the sight of an uncanny, rubbery, almost human is enough to unsettle someone, perhaps even cause discomfort. But this also happens to be unrelated to SCP-032's anomalous abilities, which she detailed to Foundation personnel when she was first contained. The Foundation security team that discovered SCP-032 patiently sitting and waiting to be found questioned her motives and how she had come to be there. There was no record of what time she might have arrived on the compound's security cameras, and SCP-032 gave the personnel no inkling as to how she knew the location of the Foundation's Slovakian site. Somehow, she'd managed to approach without being spotted by anyone, but would not explain how she had done so. Security personnel at the site were obviously skeptical and asked Brother's Bride why she had come to the Foundation. SCP-032 claimed that her creators had commanded her to, that she was to be placed in indefinite storage until claimed. Although the silicon-based woman appears to possess a normal level of cognitive function, she claims that she is not fully sapient, meaning SCP-032 does not possess the intelligence or understanding of other human beings, at least according to her. By her own admission, SCP-032 is an intermediary, acting on behalf of her creators, although the SCP Foundation has yet to be able to verify this. As for her anomalous abilities, SCP-032 was kind enough to detail these to the security personnel that first found her. She has an innate ability to influence any biological entity in her immediate vicinity. In other words, any organism that gets too close. Well, not quite any. There is a limitation to her power. SCP-032 can only affect a creature or organism not created by, related to, or influenced by humanity. So, plants, animals, even microorganisms like bacteria all fall into the category of things that SCP-032 has an effect on. According to the various tests the Foundation's researchers have conducted, the exact nature of how SCP-032's abilities work seems to vary, but her presence always causes massive and irreversible damage to an animal or organism's ability to exchange or use energy. For example, when SCP-032 is surrounded by wild flora, these plants will lose the ability to conduct the process of photosynthesis. They therefore can no longer produce or consume energy, preventing them from continued growth and ultimately causing death. In much the same vein, any animals that come into close contact with SCP-032 will find themselves unable to use their respiratory or digestive systems, rendering them unable to breathe oxygen or properly consume food. Not even germs and other microorganisms are safe from SCP-032's effects. Although when it comes to these microscopic life forms, her ability seems to focus solely on their reproductive systems, and if bacteria cannot divide itself, it cannot spread. At present, the SCP Foundation keeps Brothers Bride housed in an automated containment unit, restricting the amount of direct contact personnel can have with her. Unless they are there to conduct authorized experiments or other necessary research-related tasks, staff are to leave SCP-032 alone. Any interviews with her are not even carried out in person, and instead researchers use a remote communication array to ask SCP-032 more about her origin, her creators, and her abilities. This probably seems a little overcautious, right? After all, SCP-032 has no effect on the human body, and isn't aggressive or outwardly hostile. Maybe locking her in a room is excessive, but remember, her degenerative abilities do affect microorganisms and bacteria, even those that are beneficial to human beings. The human body is full of good bacteria that aids with digestion and helps the body absorb nutrients, like the ones you've heard about in ads for probiotic yogurt. Since 032's effects don't discriminate between good and bad bacteria, people have to keep their distance from SCP-032, or else they might find that they can no longer digest food properly. In fact, no biological material is allowed anywhere near her. No houseplants, no pets, nothing. Oddly, SCP-032 herself seems fine with this, and has never expressed any desire for any form of comfort, and does not appear to require sustenance like food or water. Shortly after she was first contained by the SCP Foundation, SCP-032 was interviewed by Dr. Alexander Kovac, the resident psychologist at the site where Brothers Bride was discovered. Dr. Kovac initially tried to ask SCP-032 to disclose her name. However, she was unable to do so. "I don't have one. People have names. I'm not one." She then went on to explain that even her creators had no name for her, and that she was instructed to cooperate with the SCP Foundation. Dr. Kovac pressed on, asking about when she told security that she was to be stored until collected, who SCP-032 had meant was coming to collect her. Her answer was as enigmatic as could be expected. She claimed that she was going to be collected by someone her creators wished to torment, and finding her in the hands of the SCP Foundation would bring this person greater suffering. Kovac asked if this person was part of the Foundation, assuming that SCP-032's creators had some kind of animosity towards a particular member of personnel, and that 032 was part of some kind of revenge plot against a member of Foundation's staff. SCP-032 denied this though, stating, "He is not one of you, merely a one-time sympathizer of sorts. He believes you tried to help him once, and if he is forced here, if he finds me here, you will die. That will hurt him. They have no interest in any of you or your organization. You are here as a tool, just as I am." According to SCP-032, the man coming to collect her was a prideful, complacent figure who won when he should have lost. Somehow this individual had apparently been punished by being forced to live in exile from his kin and wander the world endlessly, destroying anything in his path, yet unwillingly. His very presence would poison human beings, leaving this man trapped in eternal solitude, tormented by the weight of his guilty conscience. SCP-032 described the man's punishment as a masterwork of torment. She described her purpose in being sent to the Foundation as being to act as this man's last undoing. Apparently, this wanderer would occasionally find solace in looking at nature and find hope in the world around him. Her ability to destroy the organisms around her would be a way to break this man's will and the final nail in the proverbial coffin. Apparently, SCP-032's appearance was also seemingly meant to deceive him. She stated that the man would recognize her and this would remind him of fond memories. But then as he got closer, he would see SCP-032 for what she really was. A crude replica of a human being, reminding this man that her likeness would be forever out of his reach. SCP-032 was intended by her creators to be as artificial as the wandering man's hope, and when he eventually found her, either in a day, a month, or in a century, she would destroy his very last source of solace. At the conclusion of the interview, Dr. Kovac asked why this man would recognize her, and SCP-032 simply replied, "I used to be his wife." If we take SCP-032 at her word, then it appears she was created with the intention of being used to torment this wandering man and act as a final punishment for him. In another interview 6 months after her initial containment, SCP-032 expressed a hatred for the man's wife whom she was made to resemble. Sent in to assess SCP-032's cognitive abilities and personality, or lack of, Dr. Kovac questioned this. SCP-032 had always been adamant that she had no conscious thoughts or feelings of her own, and when challenged by the doctor, she claimed that she hated her mold because her creators wanted her to. The first thing SCP-032's creators had done after making her was show her the wife of the man they hoped to torment. It is unclear whether SCP-032 was shown photographs or the actual woman she had been molded from. Not an easy task, as this woman, the wife, was apparently long dead. But the creators had risked disturbing the wife's final rest just to show her to SCP-032. She was beautiful, so peaceful, serene, whole, even gone, even dead. I could see the essence of who she used to be, of who she still was and forever will be, her soul. They told me she didn't get to live for all that long, but when she lived, she was herself. She was alive, and so I hated her. In the wife's face, SCP-032 saw a reflection of herself and realized that she had been made just to be a mockery, a parody of a living human being existing only to cause misery to the wandering man who would one day find her. Instead of skin, she had molded silicone and plastic synthetic fiber in place of hair and oil for blood. But what SCP-032 lacked, she realized, was a soul. This was all part of the brothers' design, according to SCP-032. When the man found her, he would see not only what had been done to the memory of his wife, but he'd also see how much SCP-032 hated her, and hated herself for not being alive the same way the wife had been. The goal of all of this, to make the man realize that he never won. SCP-032 herself is a mystery, but perhaps the real question is, who do you think this man is, and what was it he didn't win? But that's a story for another day. Let us know what you think down in the comments.
Dr. Seymour Tracy is an ordinary American man. He lives in a 2-bedroom home with a white picket fence in an ordinary suburban town in the Midwest. He gets up every day and goes to work. Then in the evening, he comes home to spend time with his family. From the outside, Seymour and his family couldn't be more normal. But in reality, there's something very abnormal about him, his life, and the neighborhood where he lives. Seymour Tracy isn't just some office worker. He's a researcher employed by the SCP Foundation, just like all of his neighbors. Because this isn't an ordinary neighborhood, it's a functioning Site 11 satellite facility, bought and maintained by the Foundation for the sole purpose of containing and monitoring a single SCP, SCP-3082. SCP-3082 is an ordinary treehouse, 2 meters by 2 meters in size and built from ordinary cherry wood planks, and it's located in one of the trees in the neighborhood park. You might expect that an anomaly that requires an entire suburb of people to monitor it is exceptionally difficult to contain. But the truth is, SCP-3082 is only a Euclid-class anomaly, fairly tame by Foundation standards. The fact that the houses surrounding this SCP are inhabited solely by Foundation personnel and their families is, more than anything, a way to keep up appearances of this being a completely normal neighborhood. Unlike most Foundation sites, the personnel working in this unorthodox setup around SCP-3082 are mostly researchers, and their work is just as much anthropological and diplomatic as it is scientific. As you might have guessed, SCP-3082 isn't a normal treehouse on the inside. Open up the small hatch in the wall and step through, and you'll find yourself in a much larger, grander treehouse that rests on the upper branches of an absolutely massive conifer-like tree of an unidentified species. The tree, designated as SCP-3082-1, is an incredible 160 kilometers tall, and while its own species is not known, it appears to have multiple recognizable plants grafted onto and growing out of its bark. Many of these plants are fruit-bearing, and in addition to the identifiable plants, there are also a number of pitcher plant-like flowers that collect and hold fresh water. These plants serve as sustenance for the only known inhabitants of SCP-3082, a colony of around 74 children, all between the ages of 4 and 12. These children live in a village made up of other tree houses built among the branches of SCP-3082-1, and all of them match the descriptions of children from around the United States who went missing between 1996 and the present day. Curiously, within SCP-3082's pocket dimension, the children don't physically age, and while Foundation personnel can move freely back and forth through the hatch in SCP-3082's wall, children under the age of 13 are unable to cross back through once inside the pocket dimension. It's a very extraordinary anomaly, but it was up to the very ordinary Dr. Tracy to make contact with the residents of SCP-3082. Upon entering, he discovered that the children had formed their own system of government, known as the Chief Royal Council. Dr. Tracy was introduced to many of the council's members, including Wexley Olson, age 6, a junior council member, Lucy Fujimoto, age 7, who had taken the role of city planner and resource manager, Ahmed Saeed, age 11, who served as a caretaker to the younger citizens of SCP-3082, and Rachel Jeffries, age 10, who acted as a council mediator. Through interviews with the subjects, Dr. Tracy found that all 74 of the children reported they had woken up on the porch of a treehouse after running away from troubled homes. Most of the council members had disappeared in 1996, except for Olson, who disappeared in 2005. Older residents reported that some of the treehouse that make up what is now their village were already there upon their discovery of the pocket dimension. Also pre-existing within the pocket dimension was the original leader of the Chief Royal Council, a 12-year-old girl from Ohio named Aria Morrison. The Foundation was eager to speak to Morrison, as she was seemingly the first child to discover SCP-3082. But when Dr. Tracy asked the other children where she was, they told him that they didn't know. According to Saeed and Jeffries, Morrison abandoned the colony 5 months before the Foundation's arrival. It was unclear where she could have gone, as drone exploration conducted by the Foundation revealed that SCP-3082-1 was the only large living thing for miles within the pocket dimension. While the tree was thriving, the surrounding area was mostly flat, decaying, and barren. Further research into Morrison's history showed that her younger sister, Jacqueline Morrison, had also gone missing on the same night, but there was no evidence that Jacqueline had ever entered SCP-3082. The Foundation conducted their research into the biology of SCP-3082-1 while maintaining diplomatic relations with the Pocket Dimension citizens. Taking advantage of the fact that adults could move freely in and out of the hatch, the Foundation started working with the Chief Royal Council to improve the weight limits on the village systems of rope bridges, as well as providing any supplies that the children might need, such as additional food, clothing, and medical equipment. These liaisons were extremely helpful for the children, many of whom had been without adult supervision or care for over a decade. Saeed, for one example, had fallen off of a bridge and broken his leg several years earlier, and had been living with the pain caused from the bone being incorrectly set ever since. However, there was an unexpected side effect of this continued contact. While the Foundation tried to remain neutral in their involvement in the policies of 3082, through Dr. Tracy's interviews, he discovered that the SCP Foundation's presence in the treehouse had caused a schism within the Chief Royal Council. The vast majority of the children, including Saeed, Jeffries, and Fujimoto, supported the Foundation's presence and wanted to work with them to find a way to leave the world of 3082 and return back to what the children called the real world. But a splinter group had developed, calling themselves the Neverland Movement. The Neverland Movement were angered by the Foundation's interference and intended to resist any attempt to return the children to civilization. Olson had become the de facto leader of the splinter group and made no secrets about his views on the Foundation. He swore at Tracy during interviews and frequently butted heads with the rest of the council, Fujimoto in particular. At one point, Tracy overheard the two of them fighting, with Olson arguing that Neverland gives them everything they need without any grown-ups to tell them what to do, and that they would be stupid to give that up. To which Fujimoto responded, "I was here back when we were still building the village. I was here before we had safety nets, ladders, and fences, and before we figured out how to build a treehouse that wouldn't fall apart if someone leaned on a bad wall. I was here before we knew where there was more food if we needed it. When did you get here, huh? After we knew what we were doing." Listening to the conversation, Dr. Tracy heard the children refer again to Aria Morrison in a way that suggested that she had some kind of control over the environment. In reference to the incident where Saeed had broken his leg, Fujimoto said, "Mary didn't fix his leg right, and this place didn't fix it either. Aria prayed, and you know what happened? Nothing." From this comment, the Foundation started to theorize that Aria had somehow been involved in the creation of SCP-3082, and Aria was officially designated as SCP-3082-2. One morning, when Dr. Tracy entered the treehouse and walked through the hatch to conduct further interviews, he was greeted by Olsen, who was the only child in the main treehouse at the time. Tracy asked what was wrong, and Olsen explained that the tree had started to change. A wooden slide had appeared between two of the tree's fruit-bearing branches, snapping the rope bridge and making the fruit more difficult to access. On top of that, Olsen said that the apples the trees produced were different now. They looked like apples from the outside, but now seemed to be made of cotton candy on the inside. Dr. Tracy put in a request for non-perishable foods to be sent through into the pocket dimension, fearing that further changes to the tree's structure would mean the children would be deprived of enough proper nutrition to survive. Given these changes, it became apparent that more had to be done to understand the tree's physiology. An exploratory drone was sent into the dimension, with cameras and sensors collecting data on the lower parts of the tree that the children hadn't colonized. The expedition continued as normal until the drone operators spotted a hollow in the tree that had not yet been documented. The cameras detected movement inside the hollow, and on closer inspection, the operators were shocked to find it was a person. More specifically, it was Aria Morrison. The cameras were only just able to confirm her identity though, as the drone was knocked out of the sky by a falling watermelon and the feed was cut. Before the request for a replacement drone could even be approved though, the broken drone started transmitting again. In front of the camera was Morrison, clutching a roll of duct tape. She explained to the camera that she'd rewired the drone to resume the camera feed and remove some of the drone's fan blades. Using a system where the operators of the drone would rotate the remaining blades once for yes and twice for no, the Foundation was able to hold a conversation with Morrison. She confirmed much of the information that the Foundation already had on her, that she was from Ohio, and that she and her sister Jacqueline had disappeared in 1996. During the conversation, Morrison wrote down a Morse code-like system through which to communicate more complex questions and answers, and with the help of this Morrison code, the Foundation was able to conduct a series of more in-depth interviews with the subject. The first interview occurred 44 hours after first making contact, and the drone operators explained to her the nature of the SCP Foundation in basic terms. They assured her that the other children were still safe in the village, but Morrison didn't volunteer any more information about herself. 9 days later though, she finally told the Foundation her story. Aria and Jacqueline Morrison had a difficult childhood together. Their parents fought constantly and would often leave their sisters at home without supervision for long periods of time. Jacqueline, perhaps aided by all the time she spent alone, displayed an extremely active imagination. So active, in fact, that Aria claimed she was able to pull things out of thin air, warping reality around her to fit her imagined scenarios. Aria recalled that one year when the Morrison parents had forgotten Jacqueline's birthday, Aria tried to comfort her by saying that the family had been planning a surprise party for Jacqueline's half-birthday instead. She forgot all about the white lie until 6 months later, when the girls' parents took them to the park and everything Aria had told Jacqueline would be at her half-birthday was there waiting for them. Knowing the potential consequences of letting Jacqueline's power go unchecked, Aria always made sure to remind her sister to turn things back to normal after they played pretend together. One night in 1996, while their parents were having a particularly bad fight, the sisters packed a bag and ran off into the woods. After about half an hour, they got turned around, but they kept walking, just as afraid of what would happen to them if they went back home as they were of being lost in the woods. Aria lost track of Jacqueline for a moment and suddenly found herself standing on the porch of SCP-3082. Unable to find Jacqueline anywhere, Aria searched the treehouse, and in the process, became trapped in SCP-3082's pocket dimension. The treehouse inside the pocket dimension appeared exactly as it does now, but the rest of the tree was devoid of life. Scared, alone, and running out of water, Aria sat in the treehouse and, pretending that her sister was with her, started telling a bedtime story about fruit trees and pitchers of fresh water. The next day, she awoke to find a system of rope bridges and a grove where SCP-3082-1's fruit-bearing trees and pitcher plants had sprouted overnight. Aria found that when it was in a giving mood, the tree would respond to any requests she made. More children started to appear over time, and they started making additions to the village with the tree's help. They would get what they needed to survive, but the tree refused to let them go. In Aria Morrison's own words, "Jacqueline likes it too much here in Neverland. I think Jackie might listen better if I get closer to the part of her that remembers. But for now, she doesn't hear me when I say it's time to go home. Trees don't really think like people do." And so, the children continue to live in the world of SCP-3082 to this day, as a whole town of SCP Foundation personnel work to bring them back. And hopefully, if they are able to return to the real world, they'll find it's the world they deserve. It all started with a panicked phone call. A local landlady who owned a downtown tenement building had called the police in hysterics. Something horrifying had happened to one of her tenants. She couldn't possibly explain. The one detail she was able to articulate was that his room looked like a rainforest. A police response team was on the case in no time. They drove down to the tenement building, met the crying landlady out the door, and found their way to the room that caused all this confusion. When they'd opened the door, they saw with horror that she was right. Trees, plants, fungi, and even insects and animals were all over the room. It was teeming with life. The flora and fauna in this room didn't look like anything else on Earth, and given the anomalous nature of what had happened here, it's extremely possible they were right. The tenant, a university professor who'd recently gone on an anthropological expedition to the Amazon rainforest, was nowhere to be seen, but one of the officers spotted a grim clue for what may have happened to him. A large colony of anomalous mold was quickly growing on the far wall. The officer swore it was a trick of the mind at first, but he was wrong. A human skull was sinking into the tissue of the mold, and to make matters worse, whipping tendrils began to slither from the empty eye sockets, reaching for the new meat. Thankfully for everyone who was still alive at this point, the SCP Foundation swooped in and took over the situation with the help of a mobile task force and some containment specialists. The landlady, the cops, and the other residents of the building were given amnestics and relocated. The building was purchased by the Foundation and condemned while they searched the anomalous room for the source of this unchecked biological growth. And they found their answer in a most unlikely form: an unmarked cassette tape still inside the player when they arrived. The recording on this cassette tape came to be known as SCP-407. It may be unassuming when compared to immortal, misanthropic lizard monsters and multi-dimensional chaos gods, but the tape in that room, if it ever fell into the wrong hands, could cause a mass ecological catastrophe that would inevitably bloom into a dreaded XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. So first things first, what is actually on this tape? Thanks to brief samples heard in tests with D-Class personnel, the Foundation was able to discover that it was an approximately 28-minute-long recording of a song. It's performed in an unknown language and appears to be sung a cappella style by a group of unknown individuals. Fearing potential degradation of the cassette tape, the Foundation backed it up as an audio file in the Site-19 computer database. Those who've been able to listen to the song during testing have had an overwhelmingly positive emotional response, describing it as soothing, glorious, and beautiful. And for the first minute of its runtime, the song's anomalous effect really live up to this reputation. When the song is played, it massively accelerates cell growth within its auditory range. Its potency is increased by the volume and the length it's allowed to play. It's important to note that plugging or covering your ears won't make any difference. The area of effect seems to be defined by how far the sound vibrations travel. and whether you're actually able to hear it is irrelevant. But if you're only listening for a minute or less, you'll be glad to feel the anomalous effect of being within SCP-407's auditory range. During this specific period of time, it's been shown to be a kind of miracle cure to almost all physical maladies, with the exception of cancer. Thanks to the cell-growing and rejuvenating properties of the song, the Foundation discovered that 407 was an effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease, Crohn's disease, brain and spinal cord injuries, and normally fatal infections or wounds, amongst other maladies. It was like a version of SCP-500, the pills that can cure everything, but one that would never run out. So, if it's such an effective healer, why wasn't it more widely employed by the Foundation? Because of what happens if you keep listening. If the song was played for 2 to 3 minutes, the subject would begin to experience unnecessary and unchecked cell growth, particularly on the skin. The result would mostly be benign tumors and calcium and fat deposits, which, though sometimes painful and disfiguring, are not life-threatening. At minute 4, single-celled organisms in the auditory vicinity of the song begin to experience accelerated mitosis, also known as cell division. This results in bacterial and fungal growth that become extremely dangerous for anyone and anything exposed. And beyond minute 5, things become truly monstrous. The Foundation only ever conducted 2 tests wherein the song was fully played. These tests presented such a huge danger that further testing of 407 was forbidden without explicit permission from a member of O5 Command. The first test involved a female member of D-Class personnel in a soundproofed but unsterilized testing chamber. As expected, she was initially delighted by the music. It cured her injured knee and brought her back to a state of peak physical fitness, but this didn't last for long. She soon began to report intense dizziness and stomach pain, resulting in severe sickness. At this point, anomalous plant growth began in the corners of the testing chamber. It seemed as though a whole ecosystem was coming to life and evolving at an impossibly fast rate in the chamber. Over the next few minutes, the D-Class experienced a nightmarish physical transformation. Her skin became a thick, calloused mass. She soon devolved further into a thick, immobile blob of pure flesh, unrecognizable as anything human, while the chamber around her was becoming a lush rainforest of alien plants. These plants grew around and eventually on her, until there was nothing left. Shortly after, all the plants died and decomposed, giving way to a huge mound of anomalous mold devouring the resulting mulch. The mold itself began to evolve, growing large mouth and hand-like structures that it used to feed itself on the surrounding flora and fauna as it began to grow back. When the song ended, the Foundation brought the test to a close, sterilized the room, and collected some samples for later. There was nothing left of the original D-Class subject. The second test wasn't any nicer. While at first the subject, this time a male member of D-Class personnel, appeared to become more youthful and even gain an inch of height, as the minutes passed, he began to experience extreme discomfort. He soon began to vomit, with the vomit quickly blooming into plants. Plant shoots also began to quickly spring out of his eyes and mouth, until his entire body was destroyed by what appeared to be a banana tree suddenly growing out of it. Once again, the testing chamber became a whole ecosystem, this one filled with unique, never-before-seen mammals. However, it all came to an end when the room was taken over by a fast-growing parasitic fungus that consumed everything else with its spores and fungal stalks, and it looked like it was breathing. There was something concerning about both of these tests, beyond the obvious physical horror of watching death by unchecked cell growth. What was this mysterious fungus that kept appearing and seemed to take over everything it touched in the end? The Foundation tested the samples it collected rigorously, and it came to a surprising conclusion. They'd actually encountered this same fungus before, but not in this dimension. SCP-507 is a man with dimension-hopping abilities. The one problem is, he can't control where and when he hops. As a result, he's been stuck in a number of scary alternate dimensions, but one seemed eerily similar to what the Foundation was encountering with SCP-407. In one dimension he briefly hopped into, 507 encountered an abandoned version of Site-19, strewn with corpses covered in that same breathing mold. He was horrified, but decided to inspect further, hoping to find his way out of the facility and discover some answers about what happened here. However, when he found his way out, what he discovered didn't comfort him. The entire world seemed to be covered by this same mold. There was nothing left. It consumed everything. Thanks to Foundation tests, both molds were found to be similar to the cordyceps fungi, a kind of dangerous parasitic mold, except this one appeared to be a far more evolved and even more deadly version of the fungus. What could this mean? What was the origin of this anomalous song? Would it and the fungus it seems to inspire someday destroy the world as we know it and kill us all? We'll never actually know the answer to any of this, and it's thanks to an extremely unlikely ally, a person of interest nicknamed LS, a prominent member of the Serpent's Hand. This enigmatic figure had previously come into possession of SCP-268, a hat that made them almost impossible to detect. With the help of this hat, LS breached Site-19 in an incident that was later dubbed Security Breach Incident X-23. While it's believed that LS mainly broke into the facility to make use of SCP-914, they performed a curious action along the way. They hacked into the Foundation database and deleted all traces of SCP-407, effectively neutralizing it. In a note left by LS, they said, "You'll thank me for deleting what you call 407. Why would a member of the Serpent's Hand, a group of interest that is often militant in their anti-neutralization stance, neutralize an SCP themselves? The answer to this lays in who exactly LS is. This mysterious figure isn't technically one person. They're a group of the same person, namely a woman named Allison Chow, from a number of different dimensions. They meet in the Wanderer's Library, the headquarters of the Serpent's Hand that exists between dimensions to coordinate their missions. Why does this matter in regards to SCP-407? Because the nature of LS allows them to know what's going on in a huge number of dimensions at once. This means, much like the brief glimpse given by SCP-507, LS likely knows about another universe where 407 and its horrific mold have already caused an XK-class scenario and destroyed the world. And if it happened there due to poor biological containment measures, or 407 falling into the wrong hands, it could happen here too. Unless, of course, someone stepped in and dealt with the problem personally. And while the Foundation's policy is typically to contain rather than neutralize the anomalies they find, we have to admit, we're probably with the Serpent's Hand on this one. Some songs, as it turns out, are just better left unplayed.
An SCP Foundation researcher is monitoring the salt content of a large tank filled with water. Inside the tank, just under the surface, is a huge mass of rusted metal. Though few pieces have a couple specks of their original shiny surface visible through the dark red exterior. The researcher suddenly looks up from his task though. Does anyone else hear that noise? It's a terrible noise, like metal scraping and scratching against each other. But the heap of metal in the tank isn't moving. Still, the noises continue though, and the researcher keeps staring at the unmoving hunk of metal in the tank. All he can think about is diving in and letting his body become a part of it. Kept submerged in a big saltwater tank at the SCP Foundation is an object, but perhaps a more accurate way to describe it would be as a machine. Referred to as SCP-882, the machine's containment tank is required according to containment procedures to be filled with at least 40% pure seawater direct from the ocean. If at any point the rusty surface of SCP-882 begins to show signs of becoming more like shiny metal, then the percentage of seawater must be raised to 100% until the metal is completely covered in rust. Trying to keep metal rusted? That might sound like a strange concept, but you'll see why it's so necessary soon. SCP-882 looks like little more than a collection of seemingly random pieces of metal, all fused together as if they had been welded. Gears, cables, pulleys, screws, and belts, all different shapes and sizes, all made of different metals. All of these various components do not appear to be uniform or have been made to fit each other. and are instead all stuck together in one big, unstructured mass of metal objects. But SCP-882 wasn't built to be like this. Instead, this seems to be the result of one of SCP-882's latent anomalous properties, the absorption of metal. Any metal that comes into contact with SCP-882 will become permanently attached to it, and after a few days will be a new part of SCP-882. That means that any metal that touches that new piece will also become a part of SCP-882 and on and on. Because of this strange property, absolutely no metal is allowed to be brought near SCP-882, and only organic materials are permitted to come into direct contact with it. That includes using non-metal alternatives to keep the machine securely contained. SCP-882 is suspended in its saltwater tank by organic cotton fiber lines, which also require changing on a daily basis. Any and all researchers that the SCP Foundation has interacting with the metallic mass are required to wear thick cotton gloves at all times. You might think that this sounds pretty easy to contain. Just don't let it touch metal? No problem. Organic materials only. No removal of rust allowed? No sweat. The Foundation staff working with 882 probably felt the same way, until they started hearing SCP-882 make noise. While SCP-882 is usually silent, personnel that spend an extended period of time close to the machine have reported intense grinding or clicking noises coming from somewhere in the mess of metal components. While they start out low and are almost unnoticeable, these sounds get gradually louder until eventually they become completely unbearable for human beings to withstand. So then why don't these sounds show up on audio recordings? Because the grinding or clicking noises from SCP-882 are, in actually, extreme auditory hallucinations. But even though they aren't real, these sounds are more than capable of driving anyone who hears them into a state of psychosis. And here's where things get tricky. The only way to make the noises stop is to offer SCP-882 more metal. As mentioned, any object that is made of any type of metal that comes into contact with the machine becomes a part of its mass. Allowing new objects to become fused to the surface of SCP-882 will cause the grinding noises to subside, but will increase SCP-882's mass permanently. If the noises aren't stopped though, then the mental state of those afflicted by them only grows worse. And some victims of SCP-882's auditory hallucinations have gone so far as to throw themselves into the tank containing it, where they were killed almost immediately, their bodies crushed to death by anomalous forces and becoming unrecoverable from the tangle of gears and random metal objects. The SCP Foundation now requires any of its personnel that work directly with SCP-882 to report any instances of noise coming from the machine. Additionally, whoever reports hearing strange sounds in the vicinity of SCP-882 must turn themselves in for a full psychological evaluation. Depending on the results, the researcher will either be free to return to their work or will face containment themselves at an undisclosed Foundation facility. The surface of SCP-882 exhibits an extreme resistance to damage. According to the Foundation's testing, the metal structure has a tensile strength and toughness stronger than aircraft-grade titanium alloy. Despite this, the machine still seems to be constructed of weaker metals like tin, iron, gold, and many others still yet to be identified. It takes extreme heat and several hours of exposure at that to cut even the smallest portion of metal from the main bulk of SCP-882. But where did it come from? The SCP Foundation first recovered SCP-882 near an island commonly on the northeast coast of Banks Island, one of the larger islands in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Strangely, not a single scrap of metal, not even underground metallic ore, was found within a 1-mile radius of where the machine was discovered. Stranger still, the small town located nearby seemed to be abandoned, with signs that it had been devoid of any human life for quite a number of years. The collection of fused metal components, later designated SCP-882, was found submerged in seawater. The machine was coated in rust, and the Foundation has chosen to keep it in the same rusty state it has been kept in since its containment. Why? Because when Foundation personnel first attempted to remove SCP-882 from the water, and the rust began to flake away from SCP-882's metal surface, its gears and cogs started to turn. Foundation personnel on site were unsure of what the machine's purpose was, but wanted to halt it in case it proved deadly. A number of ill-fated attempts at containment occurred soon after, with any person getting too close to SCP-882 finding themselves pulled into its mass and crushed to death between turning cogs. After multiple accidents that resulted in the demise of Foundation personnel, Dr. Charles Gears authorized the use of SCP-2519 to help stop the movement of SCP-882's gears. SCP-2519 is an audio file titled Babylon MP3, which features the song By the Waters of Babylon by Philip Hayes and text from the biblical Psalm 137. Playing this file can cause malfunctions to occur in various electronic and mechanical devices, normally reducing the speed at which they can operate or causing a complete cessation of a machine's function. In SCP-882's case, the sound of Babylon MP3 successfully slowed the machine's moving parts, allowing Foundation personnel to safely get closer to it. Teams then cut the massive metal down to a more manageable size with extreme heat, and it was finally contained. However, another question arises. Surely if SCP-882 is a machine, then it must have a purpose, right? And perhaps more importantly, what is its connection to the infamous machine-loving group of interest, the Church of the Broken God? Both of these questions might just have one easy answer. To put it plain and simple, SCP-882 may just be the heart of the Broken God. The Church of the Broken God is a religious organization that the SCP Foundation has had a number of encounters with over the years. Members of the church share in the belief that life, specifically biological flesh-based life, is inherently wrong, even evil. This group worships mechanization, the process of making something or someone more mechanical in nature. According to the beliefs of the church, there were two gods, Yaldabaoth and Mechane, who created humanity together. Yaldabaoth was the god of flesh and animal instinct, granting humans their bodies, while Mechane, the god of machine and intellect, blessed man with the power of free thought. As humankind developed and its civilization began building machines, Yaldabaoth became enraged that they were ignoring the instincts she had bestowed upon them. She endeavored to destroy the creations of man, in an attempt to revert them to the animals she had intended to be. As legend goes, Mechane acted as humanity's savior and intervened to stop Yaldabaoth. The god of machine shattered himself, transforming his body into a number of pieces to form a cage for his fellow god. Fragments of Mechane rained down on planet Earth, fragments that the Church of the Broken God believes it is their duty to recover. However, a number of these pieces are cataloged as SCPs that the Foundation is either aware of or has in containment. They are SCP-882, or His Broken Heart to the Church, SCP-271, His Broken Gift, SCP-813, His Broken Eyes, SCP-1139, His Broken Tongue, SCP-635, His Broken Mind, and finally, His Broken Blood, which refers to SCP-217. Often using anomalous technology, members of the Church of the Broken God intend to uncover or steal these various components. The Church's ultimate goal is to bring the correct pieces together and completely restore Mechane's form. It is their hope that he will guide them to intellectual enlightenment and bless them with new mechanical forms so that they can discard their current flesh and blood bodies. However, the Foundation and the Church are certainly not the only groups to have a fascination with SCP-882. Near the Banks Island site where the machine was first discovered, Foundation personnel encountered a man, the sole survivor of the nearby town. This individual, by the name of Richard Wright, was apprehended and brought in for questioning with Dr. Gears. During their interview, Richard revealed a number of details about the townsfolk who had first uncovered SCP-882 and what ultimately became of them. According to his account, the community formed a cult around SCP-882 after a man named Alan found it. The machine's parts had begun to turn and move, but with no clear indication as to what was powering it. Soon, a local priest, Father Pat, also took an interest in SCP-882. Both he and Alan seemed to share the belief that the machine had been built by God for a higher purpose. and encourage residents of the nearby town to come and offer metal to it. Richard explained that the locals were plagued by the auditory hallucinations typical of long-term exposure to SCP-882, kept awake at all hours of the night by clanking, grinding, and the screaming of metal. Before long, Richard noticed more and more metal items being fed to the machine, with many local residents content to just sit and stare at the mass. He also noticed that Father Pat and Alan both seemed to be acting strangely around the machine, insisting that all the metal that had been added to it still wasn't enough. Then one night, during a communion before SCP-882, Father Pat took a pair of pliers and began tearing out townspeople's metal fillings. Richard watched in horror as the priest wrenched teeth from the mouths of ordinary people and threw them into SCP-882, but still claiming it wasn't enough. Then he turned on Alan, accusing him of hiding metal from the great machine inside his body. The townsfolk turned on Alan, the first one to find SCP-882, and threw him and his metal hip into the machine, his body breaking under its moving parts. Luckily, SCP-882 remains contained, at least for now, until the members of the Church of the Broken God find a way to reunite the heart of their god with the other pieces of its scattered body, and Mechane can rise again, an outcome that his worshippers are eager to bring to fruition, sooner rather than later. Earlier today, I received orders from my superior. I'm being sent to investigate a mysterious SCP located under a warehouse on the outskirts of London. It seems important, as the SCP was just discovered, and the Overseer Council wants a detailed report on it right away. I pull up outside of the Port Superior Canning Company warehouse. It is abandoned, and from the look of it has been for a long time. I enter the building and make my way to an opening at the far side of the warehouse. I descend the narrow stairwell where I see a small black door. I was told there was always a guard posted by the door, but there is no one here. I stop just outside of the black door and look up. Above the door handle is a placard that says SCP Foundation Department of Abnormalities. I'm in the right place, but nothing feels right. Maybe I should just turn around and tell my superior I couldn't find the door. I take a deep breath, grab the handle, and turn. The door doesn't budge. I step back for a moment and take a breath of relief. Then I glance to the side of the door and see the sliding lock. My stomach sinks. I move the metal rod aside and try the door again. This time, it swings open. I shake my head in dismay and walk into the other side of the black door. I have now entered SCP-3790. A series of dim emergency lights flicker on. There are 4 doors. On the other side of the hallway is an elevator. Hello? I say, only slightly louder than a whisper. There is no response. I walk along the grated floor. The metal rattles under my boots. I can see through the grating, and it appears there are several floors below me. I come to the first door and examine it. All of the doors are identical. They are made up of heavy metal, a sliding panel that covers a glass viewport, and placards that identify what is in the room. All of the handles to the doors have been broken off, and the doors themselves have been welded shut. It seems that whoever abandoned the Department of Abnormalities wanted to make sure whatever's in these rooms never got out. As I stare into the room, I begin to feel something well up inside of me. I zone out for a moment. When I regain my bearings, my hand has moved itself to the spot where the door handle once was, as if while I was in my daze, something tried to trick me into opening the door. I immediately shove my hands into my pockets, turn and walk back toward the black door to get out of this place. Something is not right here. As I approach the exit, the door slams shut. I race over to it and try turning the knob. It will not budge. I've been locked in SCP-3790. I begin to panic as my eyes dart from door to door, scanning for a way out. There is nowhere to go but deeper into the Department of Abnormalities. I glance down to my right and notice something lying on the ground. It's a clipboard. I pick it up and skim through the pages of the legal pad that is attached to it. Most of what is written seems like the ravings of a madman. But on one page there are some coherent notes. It says, "Think it's about time. Need to lock down the other sites before I go. Take care." There is a list of 10 Roman numerals with either the word locked or unlocked beside them. 7, 8, and 10 all remain unlocked. I'm not sure if this is a good or a bad thing, but it seems that whoever was here before me is now on their way to complete what they started. I toss the clipboard and look down the corridor, hoping that a magical door will appear and let me out of the Department of Abnormalities. After several minutes, I decide to explore SCP-3790 more thoroughly. Perhaps there is another way out on a different level. This gets my hopes up slightly, but part of me believes that this will be where I spend the rest of my short life. I walk back up to the door where I think I hear music coming from. I wipe the dust and grime off the placard and read what it says. The name written on it is Vivaldi. I slide the panel away from the viewport and look inside. The chamber is completely empty except for one object. In the far corner of the room, a violin is propped up against the wall. In front of it is a broken bow. I squint my eyes to get a better look at the instrument. It seems normal enough. Suddenly, an uneasy feeling comes over me, like I'm being watched. I whip the panel closed over the viewport and back away from the door. I turn down the hallway and walk to the next door. The name on the placard for this room is Montezuma's Face. I'm a little hesitant to open the panel and peer inside because of what might be looking back at me. I take a breath to build a bit of courage and go for it. I slide the panel open, and to my relief, all that is on the other side of the viewport is an empty room with a metal table in the center. On it rests an ornate wooden chest. The chest has been secured with a large steel padlock. I put my face a little closer to the glass to try to get a better look at the markings on the chest. I can hear a faint clicking sound, like that of a ticking clock coming from the room. Other than that, all is still. I shrug and check the next door. To my surprise, the next room has had its placard removed. When I peer into the viewport, the room is completely empty. This is strange, as this door has also been welded shut. The fourth door in the corridor has had its placard damaged, making the text on it unreadable. I slide the panel open and look inside. There appears to be nothing there, but upon closer inspection, I see that the concrete walls are covered in claw marks. It looks like whatever was in this chamber had incredibly sharp talons and was not happy about being detained. On the floor are pieces of bone that have had the meat picked clean from them. Each room is another mystery, but offers no way out of the Department of Abnormalities. My only hope is to go deeper into the facility. I push the button for the elevator. The door chimes and slides open. I step inside and look at the 7 buttons on the panel. Next to each one is the level number it corresponds to. Naturally, I'm hesitant to push any of them, but I know I've got to start somewhere if I'm going to have any chance of getting out of here. I reach out and press the button for level 2. The doors slide shut, and the elevator descends deeper into the depths of the Department of Abnormalities. The elevator comes to a stop, and the doors slide open. I step out into another corridor. It seems identical to the first one, except there is no black door on the opposite side of the hallway. This worries me a little, but I continue on. According to the placard of the first door of level 2, the room contains a man named Ian. I slide the panel open and look through the viewport. In the corner of the room sits a thin, pale man wearing a dirty straitjacket. He is blindfolded and does not seem to notice me. His chest moves slowly up and down. I feel bad for the man being cooped up in there all alone. But then again, I have no idea what Ian is capable of. The second room on this level contains something called the Crying Boy. When I look into the chamber, I expect to see a young child weeping. Instead, there appears to be a painting on an easel in the middle of the room. It has a sheet draped over it, so I cannot see what is on the canvas. But from inside the room, I can hear the sobs of a small child. The placard for the third room indicates that the creatures that are contained within it are called the Watchers. When I look into the chamber, I see 3 humanoid figures huddled together. They are all staring towards the far corner with their backs turned toward me. The creatures sway back and forth slowly. It's an unsettling sight to say the least, one that will be difficult to forget, and will definitely haunt my dreams. The fourth door on level 2 has no placard. When I look inside, I see another dark hallway, similar to the one I'm in. I try to force the door open as it might be a way out, but like all the rest, it has been welded shut. I kick the metal door, hoping and wishfully thinking it will make an impact, but instead I instantly regret my decision. I contemplate my extreme lack of karate skills as I limp back to the elevator in defeat. I descend to the 3rd level. Room 1 on level 3 contains something called the Infinite Cold. When I look into the chamber, I can see that the floor is covered with a thin layer of ice. What is odd is that the interior of the room seems to go on forever in all directions. It even appears to extend to the room next to it. but when I look into the viewport to the second room, there is a solid wall between the infinite cold and the empty pedestal in room 2. I check the placard for the second room and find that it is called Sorrow. It looks like there was once something on top of the pedestal, but the 4 finger marks left in the dust that now covers it indicates the object had been moved recently. The third room is named World Without Man. Unsurprisingly, the chamber is completely empty. The 4th room on this level is labeled Adam's Hatred. This does not seem like something I want to see, but I slide the panel away from the viewport and glance in anyway. In the back of the room is a large black mass slowly oscillating in mid-air. I feel anger begin to fill me. The rage of this creature is palpable. It's being transferred from the black mass to me. Scared of what it or I might do, I run back to the elevator and hit the button for level 4. On the placard of the first room on level 4 are the words, "The Morning Star." All that is in the chamber is a rusted sword hanging from the wall. However, as I move my face closer to the window to get a better look, the temperature starts to rise. It feels like the fires of hell are just on the other side of this door. The placard for the next room is labeled Wormwood, but when I open the panel to peer inside, there is something obstructing my view. I don't spend much time here and move on to the next. The placard on door 3 names this anomaly as Harmonia's Necklace. Within the chamber, a golden chain hangs from a post against the back wall. A single candle burns just beneath the necklace, illuminating the space around it. When I look closer at the candle, I realize the chamber has no floor. The light seems to be floating among infinite darkness. The 4th chamber on this level has no placard. When I look inside, the room is unlit. All I feel is a sense of dread, a feeling that follows me all the way back to the elevator. I descend to level 5. The first door is labeled as the Heart of Man. Inside is a human heart suspended in mid-air by a wire hanging from the ceiling. I look closer and to my horror, I see the heart is still beating. The entire room starts to distort. My own heart aches. I run down the hallway to the second door. The placard for this room has been pried off. The word hello has been scratched into the metal where the label once was. When I try to slide the panel over to look into the room, I find that just like the door itself, the panel has also been welded shut. Whatever is on the other side of this door must truly be terrible. The third door contains something called Channel 55. In the room, there is a small CRT television set under a dark cloth. I can see the light from the TV shining through the sheet, but cannot make out the image on the screen. The 4th door of floor 5 has a placard with the words Living Nightmare printed on it. I pause for a moment to think if I really want to see what is inside this room. I figure I've come this far and maybe it's just a trick to keep me from finding the exit. I slowly slide the panel away from the viewport. It makes a sound like a creaky door opening in a haunted house. In the room, there is a bed resting on a metal frame. Someone appears to be lying on the bed with a sheet pulled over their head. Creepy, I think. I walk back to the elevator and cannot help but feel I am about to reach something terrifyingly significant in my journey. One way or another, whatever is on the next 2 floors will seal my fate. I get off on level 6. It looks identical to all of the previous floors. The first room contains something called Mr. Silence. Resting on the back chamber wall is a tall wooden box. It has been painted black with a purple W adorning the front of it. I hold my breath for a moment. It's so quiet that the silence hurts my ears. The second room contains the dead man's chair. In the corner of the chamber is a wooden seat. There's no one sitting on it, but as I look at the shadow against the wall, there is clearly a figure seated there. I glance back at the wooden chair, but it is still empty, and upon a second look at the shadow, the figure is gone. The placard on the third door reads, What'see? When I slide open the viewport, it is covered in ice. I can't see completely through the ice, but from what I can make out, there seems to be a dark shape standing in the middle of the room. The 4th door on level 6 contains Apollyon's crown. There are scratch marks all across the metal door. It looks as if something was trying to get into the room instead of out of it. In the chamber itself is a silver lockbox resting on a table. Whatever is inside must be very important to someone. I enter the elevator and press the button for level 7. The doors slide shut, and the elevator begins to descend to the bottom level. I know that if there is no way out on this floor, I will be trapped like all of the other objects in the department of abnormalities. The bell chimes, indicating I've reached what I hope is my way out of here. The doors slide open. I take a few steps out into a corridor that looks like all the rest. I turn and gaze into the first room on the floor. Instantly, terror fills every centimeter of space in my core. It feels as if my heart stops, frozen in fear for a moment. I try to scream, but nothing escapes. I come to my senses and am able to use my legs again. I run back to the elevator and hit the button for the first floor. As the elevator ascends back to where I began this nightmarish tour, my body trembles more and more. As soon as the elevator chimes at level 1, without hesitation and with my shaking hands and nimble fingers, I immediately rip open the button panel and tear out the wires connected to level 7. No one should ever have to see what is that far down in the department of abnormalities, and now no one ever will.
Meet Trevor Hawthorne, now known as D4651. On the outside, he was an armed robber who murdered 2 people during a convenience store shootout in Texas. But now, since being condemned to death, he's been picked up for D-class testing by the SCP Foundation. Now also meet junior researcher Dr. Julia Reed, an aspiring Foundation scientist with an undiagnosed heart condition. The kind of heart condition that doesn't mix well with a high-pressure job at the SCP Foundation. These two woke up on the morning of December 6th, 2011, completely unaware of the fact that they were only hours away from causing one of the most devastating containment breaches Site-19 had seen in years. Many people died that day, but thankfully for everyone else, SCP-131 were there to save the day. When you think of a hero, you probably don't picture a pair of little cyborgs with one eye and the intelligence of a household cat. But this is the tale of how 2 of the most unassuming anomalies at Site-19 managed to save thousands of people from 2 of the site's most dangerous inmates. Open your eyes and keep them open. If you so much as blink, it's all over for you. How long can you hold it? Difficult, right? Now imagine you're having a staring contest with an entity that can kill you if you dare to blink for even a fraction of a second. Or even worse, a creature that could potentially kill hundreds or even thousands of people if your attention drifts from it for any amount of time. Try keeping your eyes open with that kind of crushing pressure. We're talking about 2 of the most deadly Euclid and Keter class anomalies out there. SCP-173, the Killer Sculpture, a violent Euclid-class entity that is incapable of moving while being looked at. If ever it's unobserved, it'll snap the neck of anyone nearby. SCP-689, known as Haunter in the Dark, is an equally dangerous and even more attention-demanding statue. These 2 entities are beyond dangerous. Even SCP-682 is terrified of the Killer Sculpture, and researchers have been considering the use of 689 to potentially eliminate the hard-to-destroy reptile for quite some time. Their greatest concern, though, is whether the 30-centimeter-tall statue would cause too much collateral damage to Foundation personnel in the process. Trevor Hawthorne was part of the 3-man D-Class detail meant to clean out SCP-173's containment chamber at regular intervals. While on cleaning duty, 2 D-Classes can keep staring at the sculpture while the other tidies up the cell, alternating turns to blink. But that morning, Trevor had woken up in his containment cell with a killer migraine, and soon that migraine would be killing far more than just him. The containment procedures in 689's cell were also a 3-person job. 689 is a small green soapstone statue of a skeletal being sitting on a throne, believed to be some form of underworld death deity discovered by German archaeologists in India. This is a work of religious art that demands your attention, or you and anyone else who's ever seen this Keter-class nightmare will suffer a horrifying fate. Anyone who's ever seen the statue is infected by its anomalous effects. It must be observed constantly, or someone who's seen it in the past will suddenly drop dead of a severe health issue, like a stroke or multiple rupturing organs. Like the god of death the statue represents, it appears on top of the dead body of whoever it just killed. If not continually paid attention to, it'll keep hopping from person to person until it's killed everyone who's ever looked at it. Its teleporting abilities and the fact that it poses a threat to so many make this a truly formidable foe. It's kept in a constantly lit cell and is observed by 2 members of D-Class personnel at all times. But a crucial third party in the containment of SCP-689 is a member of personnel at level 2 or above. They remain in a control room, wearing a special visor to prevent them from ever seeing 689 and becoming infected themselves. If the containment fails, it's their job to throw the kill switch on the D-Class observers to prevent them from becoming vectors for infection. Today, this job fell on Dr. Julia Reed. She was linked to the 2 observers via an audio feed, allowing her to remain in constant contact with them. And she had her finger on the activation key for a pair of explosive collars that were around the D-Class's necks. Little did they know, Dr. Reed's heart was its own time bomb. Now you know what we're up against. A snap-happy sculpture, and a teleporting death statue with a hit list containing everyone who's ever glanced at it. What can SCP-131 bring to the table? The 2 small cycloptic anomalies have only one remarkable ability. They never blink. That, and a soft spot for humans. These safe-class SCPs pose no threat to their handlers, and can even form attachments to researchers and other staff who show affection towards them. Of course, forming these bonds is discouraged by Site-19's director, because it can be distracting, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. The 2 iPods, known as SCP-131-A and SCP-131-B, are identical in appearance except for their colors. A is a burnt orange, and B is a mustard yellow. The 2 of them appear to communicate with one another via high-pitched squeaking noises, and also seem to have an innate ability to detect danger occurring in the vicinity, as well as danger occurring near individuals they've bonded with. Because of their inability to cause harm and their generally affectionate demeanor, the iPods are allowed to roam around Site-19, provided they keep out of the way of researchers and stay out of restricted areas. They seem to pretty much stick to the rules, though check-ins on A and B are required every hour, just to be safe. As the iPods were moving freely around the facility, Trevor and another D-Class maintained a visual on the sculpture in its containment chamber, while a third man swept up the mixture of blood and excrement staining the concrete floors. Things were going fine, until Trevor's migraine got the better of him. A sudden flash of intense pain shot through his head, and in a moment of weakness, he made a terrible mistake. With an audible groan of pain, Trevor closed his eyes and forced his fingers to his temples. The groan had taken his fellow observer off guard, and the man's eyes flitted over to him for a fraction of a second. But a fraction of a second is all the sculpture needs. In an instant, Trevor and his fellow watcher had their necks snapped, and the 3rd D-Class was murdered before he even had a chance to turn around. Containment protocol dictates that the door is to be sealed behind the cleaning crew while they're working with 173. But this time, perhaps due to complacency, the guards had neglected to reinforce the door. They got their heads twisted 180 degrees for their trouble. SCP-173 was loose. Mobile task forces were dispatched to aid in the recontainment effort as 173 began wreaking havoc around the facility. But things were about to get even worse. It seemed like business as usual over at the containment cell of SCP-689. 2 D-Classes observed while Dr. Reed dictated to them over an earpiece from her control center. However, what Dr. Reed thought were just minor chest pains were actually the onset of heart failure. When the 2 D-Classes heard their supervisor experiencing a fatal heart attack on the other end of the line, they began to panic. This meant their attention wasn't entirely on SCP-689, and they were further distracted by the chaos SCP-173 was causing elsewhere in the facility, murdering researchers, guards, and maintenance workers alike, which led to power outages. The lights in 689's containment cell shut down. Guards were dispatched to execute the observers, as is protocol for 689 containment breaches. But the fact that resources were already stretched thin by the 173 breach caused a fatal error in judgment from a guard posted nearby. In a panic, he opened the door to find 1 D-Class dead with the statue perched on his body, and the other one running straight for him in blind fear. The 2 collided and tumbled out into the hall. Both were now infected by 689's anomalous attention, and both were now doomed. Moments later, the 2 of them were dead, the statue perched on their bodies, accidentally catching the eye of several researchers and guards running to deal with the 173 situation. For these 2 deadly anomalies, it was becoming an all-you-can-kill buffet. The staff of Site-19 were now dealing with 1 anomaly that needed to be looked at constantly, and another that if you even glance at it, you are effectively infected with a fatal disease. The iPods, sensing an imminent danger nearby, immediately sprung into action. It would be up to these cute, harmless anomalies to save the terrified staff during this chaotic double containment breach. In a nearby hallway, a fleeing Foundation researcher heard the crunches of her colleagues' necks breaking behind her. 173 was getting closer. This thing couldn't be outrun. She turned and saw the statue standing there, just 10 feet away from her. A dead researcher laying on the ground in front of it. She was locked in a deadly staring contest with the sculpture. How long she could survive was now dependent on how long she could keep her eyes open, and it was getting harder by the second. She could feel her eyes drying. They burned under the ceiling lights. 173 just waited. This wasn't a contest. She could win. In a final moment of terror, the researcher was forced to finally close her eyes and she waited for the crunch. But it never came. Instead, she heard familiar high-pitched squeaking noises. She opened her eyes, crying tears of relief, as she saw SCP-131A sitting behind 173, watching it with its constant, unblinking gaze. The killer sculpture was paralyzed by a cheerful little safe-class anomaly. Across the facility, a similar situation had unfolded with SCP-689. The Statue of Death had claimed many lives, but SCP-131B had swooped in and frozen the statue in place with its never-ending gaze. Soon after, a mobile task force with vision-blocking visors used advanced echolocation technology to collect SCP-689 and return it to its containment cell. Everyone who'd seen the anomaly was, as standard protocol dictates, gathered up for later termination. Meanwhile, a mobile task force returned the paralyzed 173 back to its containment cell with a forklift. No containment breach is ever a picnic. Containment breaches with multiple dangerous anomalies are even less so. But the heroic role that SCP-131 played in bringing things back under control was indispensable. After all, it's not just raw power that counts when it comes to anomalies. The only anomalous power 131 needed to save the entire site was its ability to keep looking when nobody else could. They're so effective in this role that they've been seriously considered for permanent roles as wardens for SCPs like 173 and 689. And in our opinion, they're more than qualified.
Agent Ellen O'Connor was used to working normal cases in the Department of Analytics, or at least as normal as cases can be when you work for the SCP Foundation. This usually involved analyzing data and managing the Watchdog network for critical surveillance information. SCP sites and facilities were highly guarded, and major dangers usually stemmed from practical security failures that would be dealt with on-site by security teams. It was rare that she would be called down to investigate a high-priority case in person, but that's exactly what happened when she got an alert from the holding facility containing SCP-5002. SCP-5002 was not your usual specimen. Better known as Emma Hastings, she was a seemingly normal woman born in Tewkesbury, England, where she worked as a writer of detective novels. Born in 1978, she had published 10 books that had found moderate success and was living a quiet life without much to gain the Foundation's attention. That is, until the Foundation started observing strange events around her. It seemed that whenever Miss Hastings read a copy of one of her own books, the events would occur in real life. While some details might change, the main narrative of her book would play out, along with any associated deaths. The Foundation picked up on this pattern when they intercepted UK police reports and took a confused Miss Hastings into custody. She claimed to be unaware of this strange effect, but cooperated with Foundation authorities and was taken to Site 06, where she was kept in a standard containment cell. But then came the events of December 14, 2019. It was time for morning checks, and SCP-5002 was lying in bed, and she was dead. But what had killed her? The cell was locked with no signs of forced entry, and Agent O'Connor quickly obtained the electronic records that showed the cell had not been disrupted. Security cameras confirmed no unusual activity, and the facility's reality anchors that suppressed reality-altering powers were operational. There was no obvious explanation for SCP-5002's death, but something wasn't adding up. Agent O'Connor knew she needed to investigate everyone who could have been involved. Soon, Agent O'Connor had collected the entire crew of Site 06, Site Director Evelyn May, her Chief Medical Officer Dr. Nadine Grossenbacher, Senior Researcher Dr. Karen Yao, and her second-in-command Michael Simpson, Security Officer Lowry, and D-Class Personnel D-4986, who was currently stationed in Wing G under the supervision of Officer Lowry. It seemed that after her death, SCP-5002 had become the star of her very own detective story. The first meeting of all the suspects was tense. Agent O'Connor tried to present the basics of the case, but it soon descended into arguments. D-4986 had an attitude, and Officer Lowry wasted no time in threatening the D-Class personnel. Junior Researcher Simpson, meanwhile, quickly started showing contempt towards the deceased Miss Hastings, referring to her as a neutralized specimen. Agent O'Connor let them argue among themselves, watching and studying them before surprising them all with an announcement. One of the people in this room was SCP-5002's killer. Agent O'Connor had already collected much of the material relevant to the case. She had all the police reports on the deaths linked to works by SCP-5002, including the 2017 unsolved murder of British grad student Kate Holloway. She had investigated the containment cell that SCP-5002 had been held in, including all the normal amenities and the unique ones she had been given, like her electronic typewriter, a bottle of whiskey, and a fully typed manuscript. It seemed that SCP-5002 hadn't let her containment stop her writing. Now it was time to start interviewing the suspects, starting with Officer Lowry. Officer Lowry started out friendly, but seemed to tense when it came to discussing the morning he discovered SCP-5002's body. He had been escorting D-4986, who had been kept in a spare containment chamber, to his standard duties and checked briefly on the specimens along the way. But when he jiggled the handle of the cell and no response came from Miss Hastings' chamber, he investigated. He could see that there was blood all over the blanket, and Officer Lowry, now accompanied by Dr. Yao, investigated the cell to determine what had happened. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Nadine Grossenbacher, recently promoted to her position, was next to be interrogated. She reported that SCP-5002 had been stabbed at least 10 times by a sharp object, but there were no signs of a struggle and no murder weapon was found in the cell. While Dr. Grossenbacher was helpful in explaining the cause of death and in pointing out that the site director seemed to have a special interest in SCP-5002, she was cagey when asked about her own whereabouts during the hours of 1 and 3 a.m., the likely time period during which SCP-5002 was killed. The picture was not getting any clearer for Agent O'Connor. Officer Lowry was brought back in for more questioning about the facility's security systems. It seemed like his shift was well covered, except for a smoke break that he took around 2 a.m., where he left every night and left the low-risk containment area unwatched. He had only been gone 15 minutes and swore that any security breaches were unlikely due to the need for high-level clearance. Lowry continued to cooperate, but was quickly becoming tense at being seen as a suspect. However, not everyone was as cooperative. A security alert soon went up. One of the suspects had tried to leave the facility. It was quickly identified as Junior Researcher Michael Simpson, and his place in the interrogation list moved up. He was belligerent and refused to give information about why he needed to leave and claimed to have an alibi. He was working on his thesis during the time of the murder. He confirmed Officer Lowry's story of trying to rouse SCP-5002 in the morning, but claimed to know nothing about a kitchen knife found in the staff kitchenette dishwasher, conveniently washed clean of any identifying substances. Agent O'Connor may have found the murder weapon, but the killer had covered their tracks. Junior Researcher Simpson made one thing very clear. He did not like SCP-5002 and was not particularly sorry she was dead. He viewed all SCPs the same, as inhuman specimens unworthy of any respect. He had worked with her extensively in testing, but that didn't seem to change his mind. But he did have kind words for his supervisor, Dr. Yao, who had given him a copy of her keycard, giving him greater access to the facility. Agent O'Connor decided that she would need to look a little deeper into SCP-5002's history at the facility. A security video of a previous test of SCP-5002's abilities provided some new information, and it just so happened to involve Dr. Yao, Michael Simpson, Officer Lowry, and a new face, a female D-Class personnel with a classification of D-2825. The scientists would test SCP-5002's powers by having her write things down about D-2825 and then read them aloud, and then watch as D-2825 would act them out. They would primarily test this by using a machine with 2 buttons on it, one red and one green. 5002 would write out and then read a passage describing D-2825 pressing a sequence of red and green buttons to see if she would follow it. 2825 followed the sequence exactly as SCP-5002 had written it, but only once. If SCP-5002 read it again, there was no effect. While it worked when some of the text was redacted, it seemed to make D-2825 deeply upset and confused, as if she was being puppeted. Both SCP-5002 and D-2825 were led back to their cells, but not before SCP-5002 asked a disturbing question. What if D-2825 had been restrained when the text was read? The investigation then shifted to Dr. Yao, who had worked more closely with SCP-5002 than anyone. Agent O'Connor asked about the book SCP-5002 had written while in custody and was told that it was about the life of a D-Class personnel. Dr. Yao said that it had been very different from her normal works and ruled out one of Agent O'Connor's theories. There had been nothing in the book resembling the events of SCP-5002's death. She had not found a way to self-neutralize, but Dr. Yao did reveal a few important details. The whiskey found in SCP-5002's cell had not been authorized by her, and Michael Simpson had begun acting cold and hostile towards SCP-5002 several weeks into testing. She praised Dr. Grossenbacher, though, and her impressive work with D-2825 even after the D-Class suffered a mental breakdown. But there was one suspect that stood out in Dr. Yao's mind, and would soon become Agent O'Connor's next target. D-4986 had been hostile since the investigation began, more so than the average D-Class. Dr. Yao reported that he had smiled when he had saw that SCP-5002 was dead, and expressed that she got what she had coming. Agent O'Connor knew she needed to get the D-Class into an interrogation room, but first, she needed more information on him, starting with finding out why he was in Foundation custody. The incident report wasn't pretty. Several murder convictions with 3 others suspected, and all 10 deaths were by the same method: brutal stabbings. D-4986 immediately admitted that he was guilty of those murders and had no regrets, saying all his victims got what they had coming. But he claimed that he did not kill SCP-5002 despite wanting her dead. He had long hated SCP-5002 and Dr. Yao for using him as a puppet, forcing him to perform tasks against his will. While D-2825 had broken down, D-4986 was filled with rage. Was D-4986 truly innocent, or had he been used against his will one more time? Upon examining the residents of the site, Agent O'Connor decided to investigate another potential suspect, a fellow SCP. Better known as Robert Gates, this United Kingdom-born man's SCP number has been classified, but we know he possessed the ability to pass through solid objects and was in Foundation custody after using his ability to assault more than 30 women. Believed to be a dangerous criminal with antisocial personality disorder, he was kept under the influence of a reality anchor that neutralized his powers. But had he found a way to break free? Mr. Gates seemed to know more about the death of SCP-5002 than he should, and wasted no time taunting Agent O'Connor. He claimed to be able to leave whenever he wanted, despite past testing showing that he was safely confined. He claimed to be innocent of the murder and said he never interacted with or assaulted SCP-5002, but he worked very hard to put doubt in Agent O'Connor's mind. He wanted them to know that it was only a matter of time before he found his way out. There was only one person left who might be able to provide some insight about the whole affair. Director Evelyn May was a busy woman, and she had waited until last to be interviewed. She seemed preoccupied with other disasters, worried about the paperwork, but cooperated when Agent O'Connor wanted to review the data on the reality anchors for the site. As the interview went on, though, things became tense. Agent O'Connor mentioned that Simpson had been under pressure to produce results with SCP-5002, and Director May bristled at the implications. Agent O'Connor was able to get information out of Director May about her whereabouts at the time of the murder, though. She had been off-site meeting with a divorce attorney. There was something odd about that day though. For some reason, she only learned SCP-5002 had been killed almost an hour later than her body was found. Why had Dr. Yao kept the events from her boss for so long? Agent O'Connor believed she was getting close to a conclusion, but she needed to dig deeper into Dr. Yao. The senior researcher seemed to have the closest bond to SCP-5002, and a look at a past interview confirmed this. They spent time talking about SCP-5002's new novel, and SCP-5002 revealed that she had some previous awareness of her abilities before being apprehended. They discussed her plans for the plot, and SCP-5002 expressed overall satisfaction with her living quarters. Agent O'Connor now had all the evidence she needed. It was time to gather the suspects. After Agent O'Connor brought all the players together, she revealed that she knew they all had been lying to her. Everyone except for D-4986. She had pinpointed weak spots in each of their stories. Officer Lowry had lied about his smoke break, having been gone longer than he said, and drinking in addition to smoking. When he realized his drinking on duty would be discovered, he had stashed the bottle in the one place he first had the opportunity, SCP-5002's cell. Director Main, meanwhile, had lied about her motivations. She was being blackmailed. She had been covering up the consistent failure of reality anchors around the facility, which had allowed a dangerous SCP to get loose. But Robert Gates's target had not been SCP-5002. It had been the unfortunate D-2825, who experienced a breakdown as a result. And the source of the blackmail had been one of the few other people with access to the statistics, Dr. Grossenbacher, whose quick promotion suddenly made a lot more sense. Dr. Grossenbacher didn't even know the full story, but Agent O'Connor did. The reality anchors weren't randomly malfunctioning, they were targeted. None of the other cells ever malfunctioned, only Mr. Gates's. He was placed in close quarters with SCP-5002 with the intention of him targeting her by Director May, or as she used to be known per a conversation with her divorce lawyer in London, Eve Holloway, the mother of the late Kate Holloway, one of the people who died because of SCP-5002's anomaly. She had been plotting for a long time to make her suffer. But she wasn't the one who brought the knife into the facility. Agent O'Connor then turned to junior researcher Simpson, who had his own agenda. His stony and cold facade was all cover for his participation in the radical group known as the Serpent's Hand, which attempted to liberate SCPs. He had planned to break into SCP-5002's cell and liberate her that night, giving her the kitchen knife for protection and escape with her. Simpson was shocked when SCP-5002 refused to leave, because she had something keeping her there. She was in love with Dr. Yao, and they were in a relationship, and that was the primary reason she was so content in her captivity. Dr. Yao was in love with SCP-5002, or Emma, as she called her, and had been intentionally slowing down her research to ensure she stayed in her facility for as long as possible. She had been editing the footage to keep their trysts a secret, and it would have worked if Agent O'Connor hadn't noticed the timestamps while investigating the mysterious case of the Jack Daniels bottle. It seemed that there were many people with ulterior motives, but none of them with a reason to kill SCP-5002. The pattern of the blood indicated that SCP-5002 had been stabbed standing up, not in her sleep, and then dragged back to her bed. It wasn't an ambush murder. There was likely a confrontation. And after eliminating all the other suspects, Agent O'Connor had pieced together the timeline of the events. Junior researcher Simpson had made his attempt to get SCP-5002 out of her cell, but she had rejected the escape attempt. In his hurry to avoid detection, he had left the knife behind in the cell and left the cell door unlocked, just in time for Officer Lowry to jiggle the handle as he walked by and find it unlocked. He was drunk, and he picked a fight with SCP-5002. In the argument, the truth came out about her and Dr. Yao. Officer Lowry felt she was flaunting it, taunting him, and he couldn't handle it. He believed Dr. Yao should have loved him, not SCP-5002. Dr. Yao had always had a good relationship with Lowry and ignored the signs of trouble on his profile, like his history of drinking. She didn't realize he was becoming obsessed with her, and once he lost his mind and stabbed SCP-5002, he did his best to cover it up, and he would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for the mystery of the Jack Daniels bottle. Officer Lowry was arrested for murder, but Agent O'Connor still had questions. The final report on the case would indicate her great doubts about the outcome. When dealing with a reality warper, is anything as clear-cut as it appears? While the reality anchors in SCP-5002's cell were active and there were no texts detailing the events of her murder, Agent O'Connor wondered if her ability could have triggered it. She examined several blank pages found in the containment cell that had been cut into an elaborate pattern. She wondered if when they were placed on the right pages, if they could be some kind of Grill cipher, revealing a new meaning. While she didn't have any answers, Agent O'Connor believed that the ambiguity of the case possibly warranted leniency for Officer Lowry. But she was still left with one big question. In a world with specimens like SCP-5002 who can rewrite reality, how much of anyone's story is truly their own? Some of the most famous and notable SCPs in the database are what some of us would call monsters. I bet you can think of some off the top of your head, right? Everyone even loosely familiar with the SCP Foundation can recall some anomalies that are famous not because of their history or their power, but because of their terrifying tendency to prey on humans indiscriminately. There's the legendary SCP-682, which is the perfect predator, invulnerable to any kind of attack or wound. It instantly adapts to whatever was used to attack it and regenerates any lost flesh or material. It's not just hard to kill. It can be downright impossible, though the Foundation is constantly working on some new technique and hoping for success. In case that wasn't all terrible enough, it's also actively hateful of all life around it, seeking to exterminate every living thing. Or take SCP-939, a pack of four-legged beasts with bright red skin and ice-cold bodies. They work together to lure in prey and tear unsuspecting researchers and civilians to pieces with their long, sharp teeth. You might be thinking that their tactics don't sound too different from any other pack predator, like wolves or coyotes. But wolves and coyotes don't steal the voices of people they've eaten, then use the voices to lure in other humans. Needless to say, the SCP-939 instances are under intense surveillance. And who can forget about SCP-106? The famous old man who preys upon the living and sucks the unwary children and D-Class into his pocket dimension, where he can engage in an eternal game of cat and mouse with them. Unlike the others, SCP-106 isn't just predatory, it's downright sadistic. It likes to play with its food and enjoys the struggle of watching them try to escape. The Foundation barely has a handle on how to contain it, and they're constantly hoping that it doesn't try to breach containment and result in even more innocent casualties. You can see why the SCP Foundation is so wary and paranoid about SCPs that are predators preying on humans. SCP-1788 isn't a monster or predator, though, at least not directly. Instead, SCP-1788 is a specific kind of process, treatment, or ritual. The Foundation's researchers aren't totally confident on what it is yet, but they know that whatever it is, it causes a frightening, horrifying transformation on whoever the unwilling victim of it is. We call these creatures SCP-1788-1 instances. The Foundation currently has no idea who or what created SCP-1788 and why, but they're performing active and constant research, including investigating all the groups of interest who would create something like this. SCP-1788-1 are much larger than a normal human. They're almost always obese. In fact, once they're fully grown, they appear anywhere from 150 to 200 kilograms. But don't be fooled by appearances. They might look like they're simply fat, but the insides of their bodies are filled with muscle and dense bone, making them easily 250 to 300 kilograms in actual weight. We'll go into their internal anatomy more in a second, but for now let's return to the outside of their bodies. When you look at someone's face, what's the first thing that you notice? It can be their nose, their hair, but 9 times out of 10, it's probably their eyes. And SCP-1788-1 instances might fool you in that regard. Their eyes are slightly too large for their face, just enough to weird you out if you looked at them, though you probably wouldn't be able to put your finger on what exactly was wrong about them. When instances get hot and perspire, their sweat is chemically unbalanced. It has high levels of potassium and copper, enough to show up on tests but still firmly in the normal range for adult humans. As you can see, the changes to SCP-1788-1 instances from the outside are pretty hard to tell, but on the inside, it's a totally different story. Their internal anatomy has been extensively changed. During the first dissections, the Foundation researchers didn't even realize these creatures were originally human at first. The instance's long bones, such as the ones in their arms and legs and cranium, are super dense and thick, more so than any normal human. And they're not just made of bone either. They're interwoven with thick strands of heavy metals, making them super strong and powerful. Their muscles, on the other hand, have been reinforced in a totally different way. The researchers are still studying tissue samples, but it seems that the muscle fibers have been modified into shapes resembling carbon nanotubes, molecular structures that are super light while still being stronger than steel. Evidence derived from numerous physical tests run on the instances have shown that because of these structural modifications, SCP-1788-1 instances are much stronger, faster, and have the ability to withstand punishment far beyond the threshold of any normal humans. SCP-1788-1 instances also possesses redundant organ systems for several of the human body's vital processes, backup organs, basically. When one of the normal human's primary organs stop working, they usually die, but SCP-1788-1 instances can just switch to using the backup organ and keep going. The most obvious example is the fact that they have a second heart, and that it can either function independently if the main heart stops working, or it can work together with the main heart to give the instance much faster respiration and breathing abilities. That's part of why they're able to move so fast. Speaking of their circulatory system, some of their blood vessels have locks that can shut off as necessary. Their digestive, respiratory, and nervous systems all also have redundant organs. That's right. SCP-1788-1 instances have a second brain. Rather than in the head, the second brain is located in the chest inside its own ribcage. The researchers are baffled by this part of the SCP-1788-1 instance's anatomy. They haven't been able to figure out what this brain does normally when the first brain is still working, but they have seen that if the first brain is destroyed, this second brain can take over to some limited capacity. They saw it firsthand when a team of SCP Foundation agents lured an SCP-1788-1 instance into a kill zone, and an MTF sniper blew open its head. But despite its brain and most of its sensory function being utterly destroyed, the monster kept going and was able to subdue other agents before being brought down. Another main difference in the overall anatomy of an SCP-1788-1 instance from a normal human is its arms. More specifically, that it has extra arms. A second pair of arms sit just below the regular main arms, extending out of the armpits. They're much smaller, but they're just as strong and flexible. And testing has shown that SCP-1788-1 instances can use all four arms at the same time if they need to. But to maintain their cover, most of the time instances just hold the second arms folded up and close to their sides, where nobody can tell they're there from the instance's massive size. When an instance is wearing clothes and has their arms folded up, it's almost impossible to tell which is an SCP-1788-1 instance and which is just a normal, if obese, human being. As you can see, SCP-1788 causes quite a few drastic changes to the human body. In fact, you can probably say that these creatures aren't even properly human anymore. But despite all these changes, SCP-1788-1 instances are, as you can also see, really hard to differentiate from regular humans. The perfect stealth predator, right? But what exactly do instances do with all these additional abilities and modifications? Well, like we said, the second part of SCP-1788 changes the behavior of the people it infects. Namely, they become predatory. The behavior of SCP-1788 instances was hard to observe, since finding them at all was such a difficult task. But eventually the research team located a large group of SCP-1788-1 instances living in the same large metropolitan city. The Foundation set up covert observation teams, stakeouts, reconnaissance agents, and essentially blanketed the city in a net of surveillance. Before long, every little movement and action of the SCP-1788-1 instances was recorded in the Foundation's database. They observed that as soon as SCP-1788-1 instances hit adulthood, they would typically settle down in large cities, just like the one the Foundation was staking out. They'd find a job. Most likely it would be in white-collar work and middle management. But one thing that became evident was that none of them would ever work as teachers, nurses, or any other job where they would come into regular contact with kids. At first, no one realized this pattern. Once the Foundation realized what was going on, they also realized there was nothing else to learn from just observing them. They had to get an instance into containment to try and interrogate them. A lot of good agents lost their lives in the multiple attempts that were made to tranquilize, sedate, capture, or otherwise lure SCP-1788-1 instances into containment. But eventually a few were shot up with enough tranquilizer to bring down an elephant and dragged back to the site. But all attempts to force the SCP-1788-1 in the containment cells to surrender any knowledge failed. They seemed invulnerable to pain, torture, coercion, interrogation. All methods failed to glean any important knowledge about their motives from them. But all the instances the Foundation captured, while the personnel who contained and researched them could only describe them as deeply evil. They were cruel and narcissistic. They would only speak to communicate their superiority over their captors and mock personnel for trying to stop them. They weren't stupid, though. Quite the opposite. The researchers recorded very high IQs and problem-solving skills during intelligence tests, and they'd often psychoanalyze their own researchers into revealing details about themselves. It didn't take long for the site directors to ban all human contact with captured instances, lest they manipulate personnel into freeing them. Meanwhile, in the city, surveillance teams were still monitoring instances that couldn't be captured by the Foundation's strike teams. They watched them at their jobs, in their cars, and at their homes. They noticed that despite there being about half a dozen SCP-1788-1 instances in that one city, they seemed to intentionally avoid each other at all costs. They took jobs at different companies, lived in different parts of town, shopped at different stores. By sheer coincidence, 3 SCP-1788-1 instances showed up at the same sporting event. They seemed to instantly realize what was going on, and all left the stands at the same time. The undercover agents on duty followed and tracked them to the bathrooms. There they discovered a grisly sight. The SCP-1788-1 instances were in the deserted bathroom, violently beating each other against the walls with all 4 of their fists. They were hitting hard, with no regard for their cover identities, and spraying blood against the floor. They were fighting not for survival, but to establish dominance. The gender didn't matter. The female instance was fighting just as brutally as the 2 male ones, and beaten just as harshly. After several minutes of this violent show of force, 2 of the instances retreated out of the bathroom, submitting the territory to the dominant victor of the fight. They quickly left the event entirely. The Foundation confirmed this with the few instances they had contained. When 2 were put in the same cell, they'd fight for dominance. They quickly realized it was important to ensure that instances were kept separate at all times, lest they kill each other and rob the Foundation of a living test subject. There weren't many instances to begin with. While multiple of the monsters were observed in the same city, they kept a strict ratio of 1 SCP-1788-1 instance for every 100,000 humans. The same behavior apex predators like bears and sharks practice. This behavior of avoiding each other happens for almost the entire calendar year. At first, the Foundation thought this avoiding practice never stopped, but about a year into the surveillance program, something seemed to change. Several of the tagged SCP-1788-1 instances in the city actively began to gravitate toward each other's territories. The Foundation prepared for the inevitably brutal fights, but something even stranger happened. They met each other and didn't fight. In fact, they went into each other's homes. The recon teams reported that the SCP-1788-1 instances were in fact mating with one another. Apparently, an annual mating season causes this change in behavior. The SCP-1788-1 mated and then left each other as quickly as they'd met, with no emotion or care. Needless to say, SCP-1788-1 instances are horrifying apex predators. The Foundation's research and observation teams have gleaned quite a bit about their anatomy and behavior, respectively, but many of the personnel still hold the burning question: why? Why do SCP-1788-1 instances hunt? What's the motivation? While their uncooperativeness with interviews makes finding out any details into their thought process virtually impossible, however, there was one occurrence where one of the captured instances accidentally let something slip. One of the site directors was attempting to interrogate an instance using an electroshock collar. At first, the instance brushed off his questions, saying the name on his ID was his child name, and when asked by the director what it wanted from regular people, it gave a simple, sneering response.
Grow up or die. Please, good sir, I beseech you. As a man of science, nay, as a man of reason, you mustn't stifle my research at this critical juncture. You have no idea how close I am to finding a cure for this blasted pestilence. I need only a handful of live subjects to complete my research.
The plague doctor's emphatic pleas fell on deaf ears, as a stone-faced researcher took notes on his latest pontifications. The doctor, whom these clods had reduced so rudely to a mere number, SCP-049, banged his gloved fist up against the wall. And to think he once thought of these men as intellectual equals, fellow travelers on the road to scientific enlightenment. What a positively sick joke. Before the doctor got another chance to appeal for his right to experiment, the researcher left him alone once more. A truly sad state of affairs. Nobody appreciated a true scientist in this day and age. It was sure to be another day of languishing alone in this cell, wishing he had the capacity to do more. So he was surprised as anyone when the alarm started going off, and the door of his cell swung open automatically. The plague doctor stepped out of his cell and into the hall, where many other humanoid anomalies were roaming, confused as to why they'd been suddenly released. What was happening? As it turned out, what was happening was one of the most brutal Chaos Insurgency raids the staff of Site-19 had ever seen. It had been planned immaculately. You see, guards rotate semi-regularly at Site-19 due to the high-pressure nature of the job. Lots of deaths and mental breakdowns, as you probably correctly predicted. Even the administrative staff of the SCP Foundation are only human. Well, mostly anyway. So they're not immune to little oversights here and there. And it's in those oversights that expertly trained Chaos Insurgency infiltration agents make their living. No less than 15 of them had been working undercover in Site-19 for just over 2 weeks, and they did a fine job of lowering the metaphorical drawbridge for a heavily armed invasion force. The guards who weren't plants were quickly murdered by the infiltrators, and even some of the on-site task forces were quickly overwhelmed and gunned down by the high-precision rifles of the Chaos Insurgency's finest. While the frontliners were distracted by the sudden assault, the infiltrators found their way to the site's security control room and massacred everyone inside. Opening every single door in the site was as simple as putting in a few stolen key codes and flipping a few carefully remembered switches. Consequently, while Foundation agents and Chaos Insurgency mercenaries clashed sabers, high-priority anomalies like SCP-049 simply wandered the facility, watching the calamity unfold within. The Foundation was beset on all sides, shot at by heavily armed maniacs, and attacked from within by the numerous roaming anomalous entities that were eager to get their hands on Foundation personnel. Definitely not an ideal situation, to say the least. The Plague Doctor only had one thing on his mind, though.
This definitely won't do my research any good, unless I can escape and find my way to a suitable laboratory. Oh, now there's an idea.
But his scientific fantasies were soon interrupted by a Chaos Insurgency soldier swinging the butt of his M4 carbine into his avian exoskull with a supremely unpleasant crack. The doctor was dazed by it momentarily, the pain coming at him like a thunderclap, but the insurgent never got the chance to take another swing. Before the insurgent could do anything, the Plague Doctor lunged out with practiced speed, grasping him by the throat. Immediately, everything went black, and the insurgent's limp corpse collapsed to the ground.
Serves him right,
the doctor internally mused.
Soldiers attacking medics is violating even the most basic rules of gentlemanly warfare.
Then another flash of immense pain, as a different rifle butt collided with the back of his head. The doctor fell to one knee, feeling dizzy, but before he could retaliate, he felt the 2 sharp prongs of a cattle prod pressing up against his neck. The sudden rush of electricity surged through his neck, sending his muscles into a wave of involuntary spasms. The insurgents crowding around him chimed in with their own agonizing cattle prods, relentlessly shocking him until the flashes of white-hot pain soon became an oppressive blanket of total dark. Even on his most cantankerous days, the SCP Foundation had never treated him like this. When he eventually came to, he was still in darkness, standing upright, with high-tech shackles holding every limb in place. It was beyond uncomfortable for the poor plague doctor, but it succeeded in the task of keeping him under control. He couldn't move an inch. There were muffled voices beyond the dark, beyond the confines of this new containment. The modulated gas mask voices of insurgents and something else, faintly accented, oddly familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Soon the voices were replaced by another sound, the grinding of crowbars levering nails out of cheap wood. With a creaking tumble, a rectangle of bright light opened up in front of him, populated by a number of silhouettes. On either side were Chaos insurgents in familiar tactical garb, and in between them stood a tall, well-groomed man with an expensive-looking purple smoking jacket and a pencil mustache. For a few fractions of a second, his face was a portrait of excitement, but as he took in the sight of the plague doctor standing before him, all the joy drained from his snooty countenance.
What the hell am I looking at here?
The man in the smoking jacket said. The doctor, indignant at such a response from the man who'd presumably ordered his assault, rasped,
A man of science, good sir.
The man in the smoking jacket ignored him and continued to berate the Chaos insurgents, with an odd level of confidence for someone reprimanding trained cold-blooded killers.
I wanted SCP-650, the startling statue, not this clownish Ren Fair cosplayer. What the hell did I pay you ruffians for? I was told you Chaos insurgents were the very best at this, and for your hefty price, I expect excellence.
The rant continued much like this, leaving everyone in attendance, the insurgents, the plague doctor, feeling thoroughly exhausted by him and unable to do anything about it. You see, this wasn't just any Chaos insurgency client, your average tin pot dictator or arms dealer. You know the type. This was the one and only Pascal Leggett, one of the most famous, or rather infamous, anart collectors in the game. He'd been a founding person of interest for years due to his dealings with the Chaos Insurgency and Marshall Carter and Dark Limited, all to the end of expanding his anart collection, but his vast wealth and connections had always shielded him from Foundation probes. For those unfamiliar with the subculture, anart, short for anomalous art, is exactly what it sounds like. Artistic projects with anomalous properties to give it that extra kick. One of the most popular groups of interest dealing in anart is the iconic Are We Cool Yet?, which, incidentally, had recently excommunicated Pascal Leggett for being an exceedingly wealthy, uptight square who really didn't represent the collective's rebellious ethos. And considering his response was to pay the Chaos Insurgency to raid Site-19 for a few pieces for his own private collection, costing him millions of dollars and both groups many lives, it was safe to say he wasn't taking it well.
Look, we got you that other statue and that thing killed 4 of our best guys, so how about we just call it even?
Said one of the insurgents.
I'm sure you can have fun with bird brain here too.
Pascal tutted and reluctantly dismissed the hired guns. Having the plague doctor here definitely wasn't ideal, especially considering he wanted to host the ultimate anart exhibition to put Are We Cool Yet worthless Sommes-nous devenus magnifiques to shame. But he would make do with what he had. Perhaps he could say that 049 was a commentary on the ever-present nature of disease in mankind's life, and our forever archaic approach to it.
Yes, that would do nicely.
Needless to say, the plague doctor was infuriated by all this. The violence against his person, the kidnapping, the disrespect, and most of all, the interruption to his precious research, especially considering how close he'd gotten to finding a cure for the pestilence. But instead, he was soon spirited by a legion of heavily armed goons from his wooden box to a glass one in one of Leggett's many opulent hallways. There were other glass cases on either side of him, and more on the other side of the hall, all too reinforced for the plague doctor to even smash through it on his own. Damn it. Leggett's own private anart exhibition, probably wedged between his oversized dining room and his jewel-encrusted crapper. Occasionally, Pascal himself would jaunt down the hallway to gaze upon his new stolen anart pieces, and of course the plague doctor would try his best to reason with him.
I am a patient man, Monsieur Leggett, but this is simply barbaric. By what right do you imprison me here? Is your intention to deprive the world, the entire human race, of my valuable medical breakthroughs? Could you live with that on your conscience, good sir?
There was never any meaningful response. The plague doctor soon learned that Pascal Leggett didn't like his art interactive. It was simply meant to languish away in a glass box, being watched, being passively looked at. Those Chaos Insurgency louts hadn't even bothered to bring his notebook or medical bag, so he was without the tools to even perform his experiments. As loathed as he was to admit it, this was even worse than being locked up by the SCP Foundation. But all this wasn't entirely unfamiliar. There was something in the glass box across from the plague doctor that he vaguely recognized back from Site-19. He'd never seen it up close, but he'd heard researchers speaking about it, and even seen a few pictures. And such a strange construction it was. A peculiar, haphazard sculpture made from concrete, rebar, and spray paint. Quite ugly, in this humble doctor's opinion, but there was something oddly entrancing about it. And for reasons beyond the doctor's recollection, 4 of Leggett's men stood around the glass box in where it was being stored, always watching. The men were frequently switched in and out, as though they were watching in shifts, always fixing their gaze on its peculiar, malformed body. Maybe it was all the electrical shocks and knocks to the head, but he just couldn't remember why Pascal was having the piece so carefully observed. But he knew on some primal level that the secret to this would perhaps be the key to his own escape. If only he could remember. Still, time passed. Pascal drifted in and out, sometimes with guests. The plague doctor had learned not to speak. These animals could not be reasoned with. As a scientist, he would instead carefully observe until his observations bore fruit. He noticed that Pascal's guests, all people who looked equally as wealthy and pompous as Pascal himself, all seemed to look right over him, and instead focus on the ugly statue across the hall, still forever observed by any 4 of Pascal's men. Some of them looked actively nervous, just being in its presence. Curious, the plague doctor made a mental note of this, just as he did when Pascal gave his guests a reassuring pat on the shoulder and told them,
Please calm yourself. It's harmless while my personnel are keeping an eye on it.
Little by little, the plague doctor's memories of his infamous neighbor had begun to return. He knew what he must do to escape. Now all he needed to do was wait for the perfect moment. Soon enough, Pascal's mansion was filled with a bevy of Anart snobs from hither and yon. A private soiree to show off his new collection. They wandered the halls in 3-piece tuxedos and designer ballroom dresses, sipping champagne from imported crystal. All such lovely, refined, high society people. And if the good doctor's plan went off as he intended, they would all be such lovely, refined, high society corpses. The plague doctor waited until, mercifully, he and the 4 members of personnel watching the sculpture were the only ones left in the hallway. He'd been so good, so patient, that none of the men guarding the sculpture at present had ever heard him make a noise. He was so invisible to them that, in all likelihood, they probably didn't even notice he could make a sound. And that worked for his purposes just fine. Though in any case, if he wanted this to work, he would need to time his plan perfectly. Even a fraction of a second out of place and the whole thing would have dire consequences. Still, the doctor was still a Frenchman at heart, and as a Frenchman, he knew he would rather die nobly in the process of escape than remain captured by this worthless buffoon. He'd be sure to take as many of these men down with him in the process as he was able. The plague doctor exhaled deeply, drawing a lungful of air, then bellowed as loud as he possibly could. The sudden, unexpected noise was so shocking that it jogged the 4 watchers almost reflexively to turn and look at him. And in the split second that they did, the plague doctor closed his eyes. In the dark, time seemed to move slower, perhaps due to the doctor's keen focus, cultivated over many a century. He listened carefully to the sequence of sounds: glass shattering, 4 choked gasps in sequence, 4 brutal crunches, then nanoseconds later, more glass shattering. The plague doctor's eyes snapped open just in time. Just as predicted, the sculpture, being entirely unobserved, had smashed through its glass case, murdering all 4 members of personnel by snapping their necks, and then smashed through his own glass case to do the same to him. The plague doctor had cut it so close, in fact, that he opened his eyes to the face of the sculpture staring into his own, its concrete limbs wrapped around his neck. Very good timing indeed. With a sigh of relief, the plague doctor slipped out of the sculpture's concrete grasp and back down the hallway, keeping his gaze fixed on the sculpture the entire time. He had heard it decimate Pascal's men. He certainly didn't fancy undergoing the same fate. The second the Plague Doctor backed around the corner, rendering the sculpture, or as the SCP Foundation called it, SCP-173 out of sight, he could hear terrified screaming coming from the other end of the hall. He was not a sadistic man, but the Plague Doctor would be lying if he told you he didn't take just a little bit of pleasure in hearing that sound. Somewhere else in the vast mansion of Pascal Leggett, the sculpture was slaughtering its way through servants and party guests, while the Plague Doctor searched for some kind of exit. Anyone who dared get in his way was given a swift and merciless touch of death, sending their body unceremoniously to the ground. Anyone in his way was preventing him from finding a cure for the pestilence, and thus endangering countless lives. It was, of course, regrettable to have to kill anyone, but some sacrifices must be made for the greater good of mankind. Well, it's not necessarily always regrettable per se. On his way out while the murderous rampage of SCP-173 seemed to distract anyone of note, the Plague Doctor just so happened to encounter a fleeing Pascal Leggett, hoping to find some kind of escape himself. It seemed that now fate was on his side once more. To have his jailer right here in the palm of his hand would be such a perfect parting gift. Funnily enough, Pascal was far more talkative to him now. He rattled off a rapid-fire series of threats, bribes, and pleas, claiming in the end that he never meant any harm. He was the one who freed the Plague Doctor from the SCP Foundation. They were on the same side here. All this was for the art. No offense was ever intended. Pascal Leggett simply lived for art.
Then die for it, good sir,
the Plague Doctor said. And with a single touch, Pascal's eyes rolled up into the back of his head, and he fell to the ground, dead. It was one of the few non-scientific deaths that he felt truly no guilt for. After some time searching, the screams around the rest of the mansion eventually went silent. That did wonders for his focus. It didn't take long for the Plague Doctor to locate an exit, a fine mahogany door with elaborate adornments befitting a man as gaudy as Pascal, and began strolling towards it, his chest swollen with pride and a sense of accomplishment. Then he blinked, and a few feet in front of him stood the sculpture. It was there so suddenly that the Plague Doctor fell backwards in shock, but he devoted everything to keeping an eye on that monstrosity. With everyone else in the mansion presumably dead at this point, it had now come back for him. It stood there staring silently, ready to exact the terrible price for freeing it as soon as the doctor dared to blink. The Plague Doctor began crawling backwards down the hall, just wanting to put some distance between himself and the sculpture. As the seconds passed, he could feel his eyes drying out until the inevitable blink. The sculpture was standing right in front of him now, gazing down, almost mocking. It had closed the distance so quickly. If the Plague Doctor blinked again, he was sure that his eyes would never open again. All it had to do was wait as the seconds passed, and the doctor began to feel his eyes drying up again. That subtle sting quickly grew into a nagging pain that could not be denied. Sooner or later, he was going to have to. Bang! The front door flew open, and in an instant the hallway was filled with heavily armed troops, all wearing the familiar black and gray of the SCP Foundation. The Plague Doctor had never been so relieved to see the organization that had kept him locked up for so many decades. For once they'd saved him from something even worse. Of course, the sculpture didn't say anything, but the disappointment of losing that one more victim seemed to radiate off of it like a lingering bad smell. The Plague Doctor willingly gave himself up, and heavy machinery was brought in to pick up SCP-173, with the help of the iPods to make sure it didn't try any funny business in transit. Pascal had gotten away with his shady dealings for years, but the brazen attack he funded against Site-19 was now enough for the Foundation to track him down. When his corpse was found in the halls of his own home with no obvious cause of death, we can happily tell you that nobody was disappointed. By the evening, the Plague Doctor was happy to be back in his cell. His research could continue here, and in time he knew that the personnel of the SCP Foundation would listen to reason and comply with his demands. After all, science marches on, regardless of who chooses to march with it. But he would forever feel a little nervous in Site-19 after that, knowing the concrete monster he was sharing the building with. He hoped that if ever there was another containment breach involving that thing, that it didn't feel like paying him a visit for old time's sake. Flying in a plane nowadays is about as safe as catching a ride on a bus or commuting on the subway. Of course, that doesn't stop people being afraid of flying. To some, the prospect of long-haul flights or feeling the shudder of turbulence are reasons to avoid planes altogether. And then, every year, there are stories of downed flights or those that go missing, all adding fuel to that aviophobia fire. Take, for example, the infamous Bermuda Triangle, that well-known region of the western part of the North Atlantic Ocean. What does that have to do with a fear of flying? Well, famously, a high number of aircraft are believed to have mysteriously vanished while flying over the Bermuda Triangle. Their wreckage and passengers rarely ever recovered. Stories like that are enough to make anyone think twice about setting foot in a plane again. And then, there's SCP-787. As you may have already guessed, SCP-787 is a plane. Specifically, it is a Boeing 747-200, with a wingspan of nearly 200 feet and capable of seating over 800 passengers. The 747-200 is a part of the famous Boeing 747 family of aircraft. These are quad-engine commercial airliners, designed to be the safest ever built. The particular Boeing 747-200, that has since become known by the Foundation as SCP-787, is slightly different from one that might take you from your nearest airport to your long-awaited vacation, though. For one, SCP-787 has no known date of manufacture and no call sign, both which a standard Boeing aircraft would be expected to have. Additionally, the plane's entire exterior has been repainted. Strangely, even the windows have been painted over, and the paint was still wet when SCP-787 was first discovered. As for the inner workings, all of SCP-787's mechanical components, including its turbines, engines, and landing gear, are in perfect working order with no signs of any damage. In fact, the SCP Foundation's researchers aren't even sure that SCP-787 has actually flown since its construction. The plane's machinery looks so pristine that they might be brand new, with no detectable signs of any previous use. However, inside the main body of the plane, it seems to be a different story. Anything not mechanical, like the carpets and seats, have decayed over time. Perhaps strangest of all is the cockpit. Both the pilot's and co-pilot's chairs have been replaced with two masses of computer components arranged to take the shape of two chairs. So what, you might be thinking? After all, SCP-787 is, for all intents and purposes, just an ordinary plane. Not enough to put you off flying, right? Nothing more than a Boeing with a few little things off about it, like some missing seats and decaying upholstery. Well, there's that. And then there's the over 500 dead bodies on board. In June 1987, this flight of the dead was discovered several kilometers outside of the city of Bremerton in Washington state. The SCP Foundation moved in, securing the plane and swiftly getting it into containment. Now kept within a Foundation hangar, the interior of SCP-787 is monitored for 24 hours a day. Surveillance cameras and microphones are located within the cockpit, passenger areas, and even the plane's baggage hold, with recorded footage and sound relayed back to the Foundation. The idea of a plane filled with cadavers is certainly unnerving, and more than a little creepy. But why the need for all the surveillance? After all, the bodies on board are all dead, right? Surely they're not going anywhere. Well, let's talk about those bodies. How would you expect someone to die when they are aboard a plane? Maybe they'd be thrown around during a crash landing. Or perhaps a sudden depressurization might cause the passengers to suffocate due to lack of oxygen. Under normal circumstances, you might be right, but SCP-787 is no ordinary plane, and the passengers on board were not killed in ways you might expect from any ordinary aircraft accident. Referred to by research staff as SCP-787A specimens, the cadavers aboard this particular Boeing 747-200 all have dramatically different causes of death. Some of the specimens show signs of strangulation, others seem to have starved or drowned. Other bodies on board have injuries like gunshot or stab wounds, while further corpses look to have died as a result of blunt force trauma. A few have even been exsanguinated, that is, completely drained of all of their blood. One commonality among all the specimens on board SCP-787 is that some form of mutilation has occurred. 23 passengers had their tongues removed, a further 73 were scalped, 230 had Cyrillic letters carved into their left hands, and almost 500 of the passengers had their fingertips removed. Let's recap what we have so far. First, there's the Boeing 747-200 found randomly sitting in a field. Second, it's filled with over 500 mutilated bodies. And third, each one appears to have died from a cause you wouldn't typically expect from an airline accident. Seems strange enough. But of course, then there's the apparitions and noises that manifest inside SCP-787, which is why the Foundation keeps the plane under round-the-clock surveillance so they can monitor any anomalous activity taking place aboard this flight of the dead. Any attempts by Foundation personnel to enter the plane during an anomalous occurrence have led to individuals being physically ejected from SCP-787, causing severe organ damage and internal bleeding for up to 72 hours. The anomalies that occur inside SCP-787 range from the presence of loud noises with no obvious source, to the manifestation of strange human-shaped entities within the plane. The first anomalous occurrence recorded within SCP-787 was in 1988, when the sound of a loud pounding was heard against the doors and windows of the plane's left side. 2 years later, a male voice could be heard from the onboard bathroom, repeating a singular phrase over and over. Philosophers always run from the advanced thickening treatment. In 1993, the plane's in-flight entertainment system seemed to be activated by itself. The overhead screen showed a bizarre choice of in-flight movie. Colorless pictures of a deceased man, accompanied by a female voice reading a gynecology book in Czech. The same year, the longest lasting of the SCP-787 anomalies took place. This time, the plane's fasten seatbelt sign spent almost 4 hours flickering, while the first 15 seconds of Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit played on a loop over the onboard speakers. It wasn't until 1997 that the first of the humanoid entities appeared aboard SCP-787. This figure was indistinct, lacking any discernible detail, little more than just a human shape standing in the aisles. Observed by the Foundation's surveillance equipment, the figure was seen removing an emergency oxygen supply and mask from seat H43. It stood perfectly still, wearing the passenger's breathing mask for over 2 minutes before removing the mask and disappearing from the view of the cameras placed on board. The figure did not appear anywhere else inside the plane. Another figure appeared 4 years later in 2001, sitting in the massive computer parts that made up the co-pilot's chair. This figure, much like its predecessor, was indistinct in its features. For almost 4 minutes, it sat in the cockpit of the Boeing 747-200, just whimpering softly. Then it lurched forward, vomiting all over the console in front of it, before quickly disappearing like the first figure. SCP personnel collected a sample of the vomit the entity left behind. After performing an analysis of the sample, research staff found traces of nitrous oxide, thorium, bird droppings, and 3 human fingernails. At present, the origin of these humanoid figures is still unknown. Could these entities be the souls of the dead passengers, trying to offer insight into what happened aboard this flight? Or perhaps these indistinct human-shaped creatures are the ones responsible for the deaths of SCP-787's passengers? The next anomaly within SCP-787 occurred in 2005, when a female voice was recorded speaking through the onboard speaker system. The voice said, "For your comfort and enjoyment today, pancakes will now be served. Please do not leave your seat. Pancakes will now be served. Please do not leave your seat. Do not leave your seat. Leave your seat. Please. Pancakes will now be served. Yay! Pancakes." Exactly what the relevance of pancakes are to a plane full of bodies is still under investigation by the SCP Foundation. Next, in 2007, the Boeing's overhead emergency air masks fell from the ceiling, only to be snatched back upwards. They continued deploying and retracting for 14 minutes, while the plane was simultaneously filled with the noise of screams. Finally, the only other notable anomaly took place a year later, when the onboard temperature with an SCP-787 dropped 33 degrees, from 20 to -13 Celsius in a matter of seconds. By the late 2000s, the Foundation's researchers was having little luck understanding the nature of SCP-787's anomalies. Instead, they turned their attention to identifying the bodies of the deceased passengers on board. Through the use of advanced forensics and population databases, these researchers attempted to determine where exactly these bodies had come from. Researchers still haven't determined if they all died on the plane, or if someone had exhumed them from graves before placing them aboard for some unknown reason. In fact, the answer was neither, and Foundation researchers discovered something that no one had expected. One of the passengers was still alive. To clarify, the body aboard SCP-787 was definitely still deceased, but researchers identified the cadaver as a retired optometrist from Atlanta, Georgia, who is still very much alive. Foundation agents found the man was simultaneously alive and well in his Atlanta home, but also dead on board the Boeing 747-200. The subject was interviewed by agents and had no prior knowledge of any incident taking place in June 1987, when SCP-787 was first discovered. Even more interestingly, he claimed that he never even set foot aboard an airplane, which his wife and son both confirmed to be true. So what does this mean? How could the same man have been alive in Georgia and dead aboard SCP-787? Perhaps the answer can be found in a surprising place: the plane's toilet, or to be more specific, the place where the things flushed in the toilet go to. Examinations of the airplane's waste storage tank have revealed something very surprising. There was one more SCP-787A specimen that had been overlooked. It is unknown just how he got in there, but researchers discovered the body of an Indian man who looked to be in his 30s. The man, who was wearing a three-piece suit, was found to be carrying a number of puzzling items, including a surgical mask and gloves, an unloaded Beretta DT-10 shotgun, several cinnamon-flavored mints, a switchblade knife, an amulet that appears to depict the Eye of Horus, and a ticket stub for the Return of the Jedi with the number 92 written on the back. All of these objects seem to be completely random, and the Foundation has been unable to make sense of what they were doing on the man, or why his body does not seem to show the same state of decay as the rest of those found on board. There was one item that may hold some answers, though. For some reason, this man also possessed a copy of SCP-787's flight log. The log consisted of a series of coordinates, which were repeated 5,478 times. The coordinates point to a seemingly random spot in the Pacific Ocean, several hundred miles away from the infamous Pitcairn Islands, the island that the famous mutineers of the HMS Bounty settled after taking over the ship and leaving the captain adrift on the ocean. Is this location the secret to SCP-787? While none of this is confirmed nor denied by anyone at the SCP Foundation, one theory surrounding the area is that the location is another Bermuda Triangle-like location, one that contains some sort of temporal anomaly that unwitting planes fly through, only to find themselves displaced in time. Of course, the problem with this theory is that the man from Atlanta said he'd never been aboard a plane before. Or at least, not yet. It is entirely possible that SCP-787 is a plane that made a flight at some point in the not-too-distant future, only to arrive back in June 1987 by passing through a temporal breach in the area near the Pitcairn Islands. Sure, it might not explain what happened to everyone on board, but it could at least explain how SCP-787 arrived where and when it did. Every plane is fitted with a device that records flight data, in the event of a crash or other accident, known to most as the plane's black box, and researchers were able to uncover SCP-787's inside a compartment under one of the plane's seats. The recorder was found within a compartment filled with toxic asbestos and dried human blood. They hoped that perhaps it would contain some answers as to what exactly SCP-787 had come from, and what had happened to its passengers. Sadly not. The flight data recorder contained no information besides one simple phrase: "To be sorry." While an inexplicable mystery, SCP-787 is at least classified as a safe anomaly by the Foundation, seeing as it poses no realistic threat or shows signs of trying to break out of containment. The aircraft has only ever caused harm to anyone trying to enter during one of its sporadic anomalous events. But apart from that, it sits gathering dust in a hangar, just waiting for someone to crack its secrets. And who knows, maybe one day you'll be sitting on a plane that's taking you to your South Pacific vacation, and the retired optometrist sitting next to you will remark that you're passing over the Pitcairn Islands, and you'll discover for yourself exactly what happened to SCP-787.
When a hyper-aggressive lizard or an evil living cow heart starts rampaging through your town, or a sinister salesman turns up in your home, who you gonna call? Hint, it's not the Ghostbusters. The answer is the SCP Foundation's Mobile Task Force. You probably heard them mentioned in every single video on this channel, but what exactly is a Mobile Task Force? What do they do for the SCP Foundation? And what are some of the most famous Mobile Task Forces in the field? Let's crack open the files and take a look. In short, mobile task forces are the Foundation's elite personnel, and each task force is generally made up of highly trained Foundation operatives with specific skill sets. These MTFs aren't rooted in any one base and are relocated to wherever they're required, hence the mobile part of the name. The exact parameters on what an MTF can be is pretty flexible. The size of their units can vary from whole battalions of troops packing heavy artillery to small, tight-knit groups of intelligence-gathering spies. Some mobile task forces are bound to specific SCPs, whereas others perform more generalized tasks, such as securing certain facilities or territories. When the regular rank-and-file Foundation field agents can't do the job, the MTFs are brought in to pick up the pieces. Each group is controlled by a mobile task force commander, who reports to the Foundation Director of Task Forces, though the actual organizational structure of each group varies. Sometimes MTFs, which were created for extremely specific purposes, are disbanded after that purpose is achieved. How many mobile task forces are there exactly? The exact number is shrouded in secrecy, and oftentimes the answer will depend on who you ask. But you're not here for what we don't know. You want to know the details on the biggest badasses under the Foundation's employ, and we intend to deliver. Much like our video on the proposals for SCP-001, we're going to give you a rapid-fire crash course on some of the most prominent and interesting Foundation task forces. And remember, if you want us to go more in-depth into the most exciting missions of any of these groups, let us know in the comments. But for now, it's time for a rundown of the Foundation's best of the best. MTF Alpha-1, aka Red Right Hand, are essentially the Black Ops of the SCP Foundation. They report directly to the O5 Council and conduct missions at the highest level of secrecy, with most of the information hidden behind a Level 5 clearance wall. Many also believe Alpha-1 to have links to the infamous Chaos Insurgency, a splinter group at war with the Foundation. But if anyone asks, you didn't hear it from us. Seriously, we don't want to get assassinated. MTF Alpha-4, aka Pony Express, are a covert group deeply embedded into the world's logistics and postal services. The trafficking of anomalous objects is a worldwide issue, and it's up to Alpha-4 to intercept and keep a lid on those anomalous objects before they fall into the wrong hands. Think of them as a better-funded paranormal USPS police division. One object they've prevented from reaching the public is SCP-3060, a series of CPAP machines that cause nighttime visions of frightening entities. MTF Omega-7, aka Pandora's Box, was an experimental task force which incorporated the use of highly combat-effective SCPs, including SCP-076, better known as Able. The test showed initial success, but after they ran out of missions, Able's bloodlust proved to be too great for the team to control, and the experiment as well as the task force were scrapped. However, this led to the creation of MTF Alpha-9, aka Last Hope. This is a mobile task force designed to train viable SCPs to provide services to the Foundation out in the field. This group has learned the lessons of its predecessor and has employed the use of more measured and reasonable anomalies. Those include SCP-073 or Kane, the much more even-tempered brother of Able. MTF Beta-7, aka the Maz Hatters, are the elite cleanup crew for anomalous biohazards, chemical spills, and radiological disasters. So if an area suddenly looks like it's going to become Chernobyl's scarier sequel, or an anomalous fast-spreading disease is wreaking havoc over a wide area, the Maz Hatters are the guys to call. They worked closely on the containment of SCP-1280, a kind of parasitic nematode worm that often injects false memories into their victims. MTF Gamma-5, aka Red Herrings, are the Foundation's chief disinformation division. They prevent the leaks of classified info to the public, and on the rare occasions that this information does somehow get out, they're in charge of burying it and administering necessary amnestic treatment to those affected. It's a thankless job, but you won't remember they did it either way. They gave amnestic treatment to the traumatized victims of SCP-1618, a malevolent urinal which replaced the user's valuables with disgusting alternatives, from toilet paper to pig intestines. MTF Gamma-6, aka Deep Feeders, investigate and track deep-sea or oceanic anomalies, a job that commands the ultimate respect from people with thalassophobia. That's the fear of the deep ocean. If something terrifying and mysterious is stirring down there in the abyss, you better believe Gamma-6 are going to be the first ones down. They keep a close eye on a number of anomalies such as SCP-1264, an underwater amalgamation of sunken ships eager to drag down more vessels and add them to its mass. MTF Gamma-13, aka Asimov's Lawbringers, are a specialized task force devoted to investigating, tracking, and apprehending anomalies originating from Anderson Robotics, a group of interest that produces anomalous robots and machines. This includes examples of SCP-2806, a number of advanced anomalous prosthetic body parts that wish to attach themselves to a lacking host, whether they want it or not. MTF Delta 5, aka Frontrunners, are a large group of autonomous deep cover agents buried in various groups of interest across the globe. It's their job to gather intelligence from within to aid in the apprehension of anomalies before these groups can get their hands on them. They also sometimes make use of anomalies to track down others, such as when they requested to use SCP-185, a Russian R-105M radio used during the Cold War that can receive signals from any time period, including encrypted ones, but can also emit sound waves so powerful they can literally kill you. MTF Epsilon 9, aka Fire Eaters, are the Foundation's resident pyromaniacs. They're the ones sent into missions involving extremely high-temperature environments, and they're also highly skilled in the use of powerful incendiary weapons. If the Foundation needs to burn or avoid getting burned, the Fire Eaters are the ones for the job. Their vital skills assisted in containing SCP-165, massive colonies of carnivorous, parasitic mites that eat prey to the bone. MTF Epsilon 11, Nine-Tailed Fox, are another one of the most classified mobile task forces existing only under the oversight of the Red Right Hand. They work internally and are only dispatched to Foundation sites when standard protocols fail and multiple breaches are imminent. They were brought in to deal with the SCP-2139 incident, a strange psychological phenomenon that inexplicably increased the suggestibility of Foundation staff at Site-35. This made the infected staff agree with everything they heard. MTF Zeta-9, Mole Rats, are a task force that specializes in the exploration and containment of anomalous areas that are either enclosed or underground, particularly if, due to the effects of the anomaly, the space-time fabric of the area is unstable. You may remember them from our series on SCP-1730, the mission into and out of the anomalous Site-13. MTF Eta-10, aka See No Evil, are a team that specializes in taking on dangerous memes and cognitohazards that affect the victims through visual contact. One example is SCP-1561, a crown that when worn causes all those who see the person wearing the crown to imagine the wearer as their king and immediately adopt positions of servitude, while MTF Eta-10, aka Savage Beasts, serve the opposite purpose. They deal with musical or auditory anomalies and any cognitohazards that work through the medium of sound, like SCP-2402, a chord progression which can regenerate old or dying cells. MTF Theta-4, aka Gardeners, are a crack team of agents who face off against any botanical or plant-like anomalies. Their skills were put to use against SCP-1147, a collection of plum tree seeds which can grow out of literally any substance, even ones that are totally inorganic. MTF Theta-90, aka Angle Grinders, are a team that specialize in two of the most frightening things out there: anomalies and math. These brainiacs deal with anomalous mathematical issues, like warped topologies and geometries. Even listing an example of the kind of anomalies they deal with here will make your head hurt, so just be thankful they're out there. MTF Iota-10, or Damn Feds, are a huge network of undercover agents based in federal and local law enforcement agencies across the globe. They intercept any anomalous objects, beings, or information and make sure that it makes its way out of police evidence lockers and into Foundation hands without incident. MTF Kappa-10, or Skynet, is a temporary team of combined meat space and virtual agents tracking down and disrupting anomalous cyber threats, such as SCP-2987, an external hard drive basically capable of turning artificial intelligences into living souls for trades with soul-consuming anomalies. MTF Lambda-5, aka White Rabbits, are a group that specializes in combating reality warpers of all types, whether they're messing with space-time or exhibiting godlike powers. Some anomalies even respond directly to them, like SCP-2446, a phenomenon where corpses often identical to living White Rabbits team members suddenly manifest around San Jose, California. MTF Lambda-12, Pest Control, are a group of agents who exclusively go after anomalous vermin. Incidentally, they're one of the only MTFs who've never lost members in the line of duty. Their purview includes SCP-2810, an anomalous pathogen that causes the victim's cells to become tiny versions of their own species, like a human cells becoming cell-sized humans. MTF Lambda-14, One-Star Reviewers, are a task force that deal with retail-oriented anomalies. Their main focus has become combating a sinister group of interest known as the Ambrose Restaurant, a chain of extra-dimensional restaurants with strange and anomalous food and service. MTF Mu-3, aka Highest Bidders, is a mobile task force devoted to preventing the group of interest, Marshall, Carter, and Dark Limited, from disseminating dangerous anomalous objects and then obtaining and containing these objects. One such object is SCP-2818, a number of 50 cal sniper rifles that, when fired, turns the shooter into a bullet and fires them. MTF Move4, aka debuggers, are particularly useful in the modern age as they track and contain anomalous electronics and technology, including isolating and containing anomalous websites and software. One of the anomalies dealt with by the debuggers is SCP-896, an online role-playing game that improves the physical and mental attributes of the player when they name their character after themselves. Remember when we said you didn't need to call the Ghostbusters? Well, that wasn't entirely true. Sometimes you need to get MTF Mu13, aka Ghostbusters, on the line, since they're an MTF whose specialty is tracking intangible or incorporeal anomalies, particularly those considered sapient or sentient, and they're on call 24 hours a day to serve all your supernatural containment needs, like when you're plagued by SCP-1036, which are a number of haunted Congolese fetish dolls. MTF Nu 7, aka Hammer Down, are the ones you need to call when you need real heavy-duty work. They're a huge force with a massive stock of army vehicles and heavy weaponry, and are only called in for truly catastrophic events. They're also assisted in the containment of SCP-939, the voice-imitating, amnestic-producing red monsters. MTF Epsilon 6, aka Village Idiots, are a group of agents whose specialty is investigating and containing anomalous phenomena that occur in rural or suburban areas. If you live in a small town and you're on the run from a vicious monster, you better hope the Village Idiots are on their way. They've contained SCP-2561, a cat with a vintage television set for a head, capable of causing painful tinnitus. MTF Pi 1, aka City Slickers, are pretty much the exact opposite of the Village Idiots. They pursue anomalies in densely populated urban areas, particularly in the New York metropolitan area. They assisted in the ongoing containment of SCP-1155, the incredibly bloodthirsty predatory street art. MTF Sigma 66, aka 16 Tons, are basically the Foundation's own version of the Suicide Squad. They're a team made from captured members of other groups of interest who aren't particularly loyal to the Foundation, but whose very particular set of skills make up for that fact. MTF Tau 5, aka Samsara, are another group you might remember from the events of SCP-1730. These are a group unlike any other, immortal cyborgs made from the flesh of a dead god, who can be upgraded as needed. They're equipped with experimental and state-of-the-art Foundation technology to take on thaumaturgic, magical, and psionic threats. MTF Psi 7, aka Home Improvement, is a team specializing in structural anomalies. In plain speak, they deal with anomalous activities concerning buildings, containing, and sometimes even demolishing when necessary, with a variety of heavy artillery. For example, they counteract the nightmarish SCP-3050, a building in North Carolina that once a year fuses all living matter inside its own structure on an atomic level. MTF Psi 8, aka the Silencers, are a team devoted to containing reanimation anomalies and those who've been affected by them. If you've just come back from the dead, then the Silencers are going to want to know your location. MTF Omega Zero, aka Ara Orun, are another highly classified mobile task force that's actually the memories of deceased Foundation personnel preserved on the Foundation intranet system. Their job is to protect their surviving co-workers against informational threats on the servers. They also contain SCP-3664, a damaged but highly advanced assault rifle existing in the non-physical conceptual space. It can only be interacted with by thinking about interacting with it. And last but not least, MTF Omega 12, aka Achilles Heel, is an anomalous task force, and these powerful reality warpers from another dimension hunt down dangerous and powerful reality warpers in ours. You can thank these guys for every single day that our reality continues on as normal, or whatever normal means now. They're enemies of SCP-3155, members of the iconic Pinkerton Detective Agency with anomalous abilities relating to combat. Alright, we did it! Of course, even this is only a sample of the vast number of mobile task forces at the Foundation's disposal who put their lives at risk every day to keep humanity, normality, and reality intact. They seem to have a task force perfectly tailored to every threat we could possibly encounter, and as new threats are cataloged, more mobile task forces are sure to arise to meet them. Want more in-depth explorations of any of these groups and their epic missions? Let us know in the comments below. Now go check out SCP-1730 Epic Battle at Site-13 and SCP-2662 Cthulhu for more of the mobile task forces you love right now.